My name is Jason Higgins, and I'm an intern with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at the OSU Library. I'm in Oklahoma City at the Oklahoma History Center to interview Shane Riley and discuss his experiences in the United States military. This is part of the Spotlighting Oklahoma Oral History project. Shane, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks.
Let's begin with when you were born and where you were born.
I was born in Durant, Oklahoma in 1971. My mother and father were a seamstress and a construction worker in Bryan County. My family had mostly come all from Oklahoma. My grandparents lived out in western Oklahoma around Snyder. And my granddad was a World War II veteran and had talked to me a lot, told me stories about World War II, and I learned later, I was the only grandson. I learned later from my mother that I was the only one that had my granddad's stories. And then my dad was in the military in the 65, 66 time frame in the 3rd Armored Division in the NATO buildup, kind of facing off against the Cold War during the Russian buildup there. And he was an infantryman back in those days. So I grew up interested in and around kind of military history in the family forever.
Interesting. Tell me a little bit about Durant. Is that a small town?
It was then. Durant's been growing for several years as Dallas, Texas grows north toward the border. But yeah, it's a small town. We had cows, and I grew up out on a ranch, running around the woods and baling hay in the summers and cutting wood in the winters, and generally playing Army out in the woods all the time myself as a kid. I started out at school at Bogue Chitto, which is a little town 13 miles east of Durant. It was a little Class B school. Had just enough kids to make a baseball team and just enough kids to make a basketball team, and everybody went home and worked on the farm in the evening.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I've got a sister that's 8 years younger than I am. Rebecca is her name. There's Rebecca's all over my family. My grandmother on my mom's side was Rebecca Wanda. My mom's Rebecca Arlene. My sister is Rebecca Janelle, and my wife is Rebecca as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, lots of Rebeccas.
So you went to a small school. What was the education atmosphere like?
It was really good. I was in a class at Bogue Chitto of 23, I think, and the teachers over there were very dedicated to teaching the kids and setting us up for success, because it was a small town, and I'm convinced that those classroom sizes, that the teachers were invested in the success of those kids, because they knew us and knew our families and knew where we came from, and their cattle were on the other side of the fence from ours, and,
right.
And you weren't ever just a name or a number. Everybody in a community that size cares about the success of their kids and their friends' kids. So I got a good education, I thought, growing up.
Interesting.
And then when I was a sophomore, I got big enough to transfer to drive. I transferred to Durant to go to a bigger school. I played baseball and basketball up there, and played 1 semester of football, or 1 year of football my senior year. Got a buddy of mine talked me into that. But I was interested in the computer science programs and things that they had there that were a little more progressive for southeastern Oklahoma in 1988 or 89. So I was always kind of interested in technologies and things that I thought would probably turn into something like HD streaming live video and computer internet all over the world that we hadn't really quite figured out at that time.
Right. So this is kind of the Reagan-Bush era growing up.
Yeah, my granddad was a staunch Democrat from back in the times when the Democratic Party was more aligned with the Southern culture, I guess. And I remember well when I was a kid the consternation of beef prices going up and down, and gas prices rising in the Carter years, and then I remember real well the shift to Reagan coming into the White House, and my granddad just thought it was terrible, but now as I'm a older man, I kind of saw that a lot of his ideas in that party were going away. But yeah, I remember all those Reagan and Carter years as a kid quite a bit.
Were you involved in any Boy Scouts or anything like that?
I was, yeah. That's something that me and a lot of my friends and military buddies in the military have talked about over the years. How many of us were in the Boy Scouts. Boca Chica had a little Cub Scout program, and later Boy Scout program, and we always had trouble keeping enough kids to keep it going.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in the Boy Scouts as a kid. My mom was a little Cub Scout den master, I guess it was. She tried to help out with that, and then that program closed because we ran out of enough kids to do it. And when I transferred to the new school in Durant, I ran into some guys that were doing scouting up there and tried to get back in it and finish, because I was just short of being an Eagle Scout at that time. And I missed by one merit badge being an Eagle Scout. You had to do a finance class or a finance project, and you had to do it over a 3-month period. And by that time, I'd already been to basic training and come back, so I had joined the Guard when I was 17. And I ran out of time to get my Eagle Scout because of that finance badge before I turned 18. So I just barely missed it.
So tell me what factors contributed to your joining the National Guard?
Well, like I said, I'd always been interested in the military. Grew up with a prior service military dad. My granddad, who was a World War II vet, and had told me all his stories of fighting across Europe and being stationed in England and Portugal and Spain and France, and the hardships and the camaraderie growth that he experienced, and I could tell how much it had affected, changed, and endeared him to the men that he was with. And then, kind of by happenstance, I'd always intended to join the Army. I had intended always to go on active duty and do something special ops or crazy or exciting, whatever, adrenaline junkie kind of stuff. And I ran around all the time as a kid with a Ranger Regiment flash on a hat or a beret. I thought I was going to go be a Ranger when I grew up. And a friend of mine from high school, Billy Schultz, caught me one day and said, "Hey, I've got a cousin that's in the National Guard here in the 180th headquarters. The 1st 180th Infantry Battalion was there in Durant." He said, "We ought to go out there and check that out." We were 16, about to turn 17. So we went and checked it out, and they took us to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas with them for a drill weekend. And they took us out and let us throw hand grenades, shoot machine guns, fed us a steak. So for a bunch of 16-year-old kids, and we said, "I'm in. We'll be back next month after we turn 17. We joined immediately.
How did your father feel about that?
Mom and Dad, they were all real happy about it that I had joined, because it, for them, I was also looking at the future for college.
Mm-hmm.
And the National Guard at that time, we didn't have as many of the benefits as we have now, but it gave me a way into college, coming from a poor farming, ranching community.
Right. I
had a way to pay for school that way, at least make it survivable.
Had college always been in your career plans?
It had. I hadn't really ever, as a young kid, hadn't really thought through and kind of reconciled how would I go to college and be in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
And really, when I joined the Guard at 17, I thought that I could, when I turned 18, I could just transfer over to the active duty force, but I didn't understand how the contracts work between National Guard and active duty. Really, once you're committed to the National Guard, you're committed to the National Guard for the terms of your enlistment, which at that time for me would have been 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it turned out for the best, and it's hard for me to describe to somebody now what kind of a difference that made in my life, my career path, to be able to go the way that I did. Even though sometimes it wasn't really the way I had meant to choose.
Right. Talk a little bit about the training process.
I went to basic training. I joined the Guard on January 6, 1989, and I did about the first 3 months. I just showed up at the unit and would drill with the unit. I kind of got lucky there that I was assigned as the driver for the battalion commander. So I was in position for an infantry private. I was 11 Bravo infantry soldier. But walking in on day one and being put in the vehicle or in the operations center with that lieutenant colonel who was in charge of the entire organization there, 668 man infantry battalion, I got to see things from the top down and understand to some extent what I could as a brand new kid, what was he doing and why, and I learned the structure of the organization, not just what a new person walking in from the outside would see. So I got to see things from kind of the top down, which is good for the way my brain works, is I'm one of those take it apart and see how it works kind of guys. So when I went off to basic training, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia that summer between my junior and senior year, and it was tough. It was hot. There was a lot of running, a lot of physical, a lot of challenges, but it was pretty natural for me because I had grown up out in the country. I carried a rifle or a shotgun or something since the time that I could carry one, and was always out hunting, fishing, fiddling around the woods with my family or my dad or my grandparents or whatever. So it was a pretty natural fit for me. The physical aspect wasn't bad because I joke around that little boys don't get tired. You just go until you fall asleep and they get up and go again.
Right.
But when I went into basic training, it was recently after Grenada, Panama thing was happening about that time frame, and then when I went back the next summer for my AIT, Advanced Individual Training, which that's where they teach you the specifics about being an infantry enlisted man, then that's about the time that the Gulf War was ramping up. So there was a lot of recent and current activity at the time happening that kind of gave the training a focus. And it was a little rougher then than it is now. And I think every generation says that about the military. I just got back from Fort Jackson, South Carolina yesterday to observe some of their basic training down there because of my current position, and I can see that we've backed off on a lot of the harshness of the way we used to treat people, which I don't disagree with at all. I think every generation has a different set of experiences, learns in a different way, and we jokingly call this now the kinder, gentler Army, but in some ways it is. Which, not to get too philosophical, but I kind of agree with that as a principle because the democracy we have is based kind of on the Greek system that says you're one citizen with one vote, and I try to treat my soldiers the same way. They've got just as much right in this Army as I do. So,
can you give us an example of one of the differences as far as?
There's lots. We, the physical discipline, the yelling and screaming and name calling and poking in the chest and throwing stuff at you that happened in the 70s and 80s. My dad, I don't know if it was real or if it was a joke, said, they'd throw your wall locker at you when he was in the military. I never had anybody throw a wall locker at me, but they would certainly get in your face and get physical with you. But it was, it was all meant to challenge you and push you to learn, to kind of learn how to adapt and get into the Army's, in some regards, unquestioned discipline at the times that you need it, so that when I ask you to do something that could risk your life, you understand that I'm not doing it because, for any malfeasant reason, I'm just doing it.
Right.
And because it has to be done for mission accomplishment. And when I ask you to do that, I'm doing it because I absolutely have to, and you can't hesitate.
What you're describing sounds a lot like the Marine process of the tearing down and the building back up.
Yeah, that's the same kind of thought process that we have. The training programs are virtually the same for all those forces. We just do it in a different uniform, a little different way, and different length of time, different post.
So tell me about graduating from boot camp. Was there pride in being able to make it?
I know there was. It's been so long that's I've been in for 26 years now. That my graduation day at boot camp was pretty vague at this point. I was just glad it was over and I could go back home for my senior year of high school. But yeah, I think mostly I was looking forward to going home and getting something to eat. I thought they were going to starve me to death down there at basic training.
So, during the first 6 years of your enlistment, what were some of the key points?
Well, again, that pretty probably important developmental time for me, because I was assigned there in the operations center for a battalion headquarters. So I was in an infantry battalion, and I was in the 180th is the infantry battalion that's based out of southeastern Oklahoma. That's since converted to be a cavalry squadron. But being in that operations center, again, I got to see things from the top down. Mm-hmm. And I learned my job as a basic soldier, but then I also got to see what was going on 1, 2, 3 levels above me in the organization to really learn Army operations in a lot more detailed manner than most other young guys at that time would have had the opportunity to do. I ran into a friend of mine that had gone to basic training with me out of our battalion one drill weekend, and just in passing I said, "Hey man, how are you doing? What's going on?" And we chatted for a minute, and I said, What company are you in?" He looked at me and he said, "I don't know." and I said, and he asked one of his buddies and said, "Hey, what company are you in?" He said, "Well, we're in 1st Platoon." And I said, "Well, what company though?" So I had to ask him. He said, "What town do you go to drill in?" He told me. I said, "Okay." He said, we go to Poto." I said, "Okay, you're in Bravo Company." Mm-hmm. So, and it was one of my peers. So I knew immediately, I had a different perspective than the average guy did at that time. But,
right.
I saw the entire organization up, down, left to right, and a lot of those young guys didn't concern themselves with that. And being in an operations center and getting to see when we would play, war games and training environment, et cetera, I got to see us track the battle, put everything up on a map, and keep track of the personnel and logistics that were required to support a fight in in the notional environment. And it helped me to begin to kind of hone my skills as an operations guy later. Now,
these tactics, would you describe them during that time as conventional warfare or counterinsurgency?
Yeah, we were very much focused on a conventional fight. Dig foxholes, prepare to fight the Russians when that Cold War mentality, and the Russians fought off of a very systematic, very controlled process. Artillery barrage, followed by smoke, followed by a reconnaissance effort, followed by your main line of forces, and it was everything's done with a stopwatch. 10 minutes later, we'll start this. You can expect your advanced guard main body, your combat reconnaissance patrol. We had the order of battle that came from the Soviet doctrine, and we would study that and rehearse to fight against it.
That's a very World War II
very
European theater.
And just today the Army's in that same position now that we fought 10 years of counterinsurgency in a real nondescript fight that we really never got our head completely around. Now that we've taken the lessons we learned in that 10 years of combat, and we're trying to say, okay, what do we do now? In 1989, 1993, we were still training to fight the last war.
Was there
the war
any?
That never happened.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Was there any thinking of going to the Gulf War during that time?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was in basic training, the build-up for the Gulf had not happened yet. When I went back the next summer, the summer of my senior year in 1990, that summer between my senior year of high school and freshman year of college, the talk of the Gulf War had kind of started to bubble under the surface, and the tension had began. The invasion of Kuwait had happened, and there was a lot of talk about, especially for the active duty soldiers, you're going straight to Saudi Arabia when you leave here. Mm-hmm. And a lot of time that was the drill sergeants trying to put some intensity and some focus into their training day. But it was absolutely out there, and I could see that year between my first trip to Fort Benning and the second the next summer, the shift away from the the rhetoric about the Soviet Union and communism over to the rhetoric about fighting against Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis taking over another country. And then when I went to Stillwater, just OSU, my freshman semester, and I sat in the little common area at the dorms there at Southeast or at OSU, and listened to General Shinseki, I believe it was, start naming off the National Guard brigades that were going to be mobilized to go to the Gulf War. So I'm a 19-year-old freshman in college, specialist E4, and watching CNN on the little grainy TV in 1990, and as he's reading through the list of mobilizing National Guard units, he gets down to the 40, and I was in the 45th, and he says the 40 and stops and clears his throat. And in the time it took that man to clear his throat, I had thought myself through disenrolling from college, driving back to Durant from Stillwater, packing my bags, getting my belongings put back at my mother and father's house, and reporting to my unit and wondering what I was supposed to do when I got there. And so the 48th Brigade out of Georgia, he says, so it wasn't us. So I didn't, that was my 1 second scare to go to the Gulf War, but then we were never mobilized.
Was there a disappointing feeling about that? Or?
No, I was relieved at the time. At that time in 1990, in an army that hadn't been to a major conflict since Vietnam, especially as a young, brand new private, it was hard for me to kind of wrap my head around what our capabilities really would have been. And the statistics being thrown around about the Iraqi army in recent history that I knew about them at that time is that they'd been in a long, protracted conflict with Iran, which means they would have had some combat capabilities and some experience. And then they were touted as having the third largest army in the world. So I thought, man, these guys probably know what in the world they're doing. We haven't even been in a war since, other than a couple small conflicts, Grenada, Panama, whatever was going on in South America, and then, some peacekeeping missions, places like Beirut, and
it's kind of hard for the current American public to wrap our minds around that, but we were still recovering psychologically from Vietnam.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I was anxious about what that conflict would look like, and was absolutely amazed, as was the rest of the world, when it turned out to be a 100-hour war, and we, in the use of air power and artillery and the technologies that we began to bring to the battlefield, we saw really that was the change in modern American warfare. That war made anyone who thought they were going to stand up to us face to face begin to question what their tactics were going to be in the future. And since that time, you've never seen an army stand up toe to toe with the Americans in uniform and say, "Yeah, let's go." It's and even the second invasion of Iraq, they wore uniforms for maybe a day or two and said, "Hey, this isn't going to work. Go take off your uniform, blend into the population, and let's turn this into a counterinsurgency."
Right. So tell me about the first time in your life where your occupation in the military became international.
Probably the best way to describe that is 9/11 for me. I was a traditional guardsman. I had been in the Guard for 11 years. I went to officer candidate school in 1998 here at Oklahoma Officer Candidate School, the National Guard. Really at the time kind of questioned if I wanted to stay in the Guard or not. And I got a letter in the mail that says, "We see that you've got a college degree and I was a sergeant by then in E5. See that you're an NCO with a college degree, and we'd like to invite you to attend officer candidate school." So, and at that time I was near the end of my second enlistment. I had my degree. I was almost finished with my master's, and I thought, it's probably time for me to get out of the Guard and go on find a civilian career and go on with my life. Had kind of lost interest in what was going on in the Guard at that time. So went to officer candidate school, came back, went down to Fort Benning again for my officer basic course where they teach you how to be an infantry officer, infantry lieutenant. And then about a year or two later, I was going back for the captain's career course. Decided that I'd stay in, that I was getting into some positions where I enjoyed the work again, and I was challenged, and I could see some positive change happening in the organization. We were kind of modernizing ourselves in the way we thought and the way we fought. So I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, and at Building 4, which Building 4 is the building at Fort Benning where all the training programs are. The infantry captain's career course that prepares you to be a company commander was in that building, and I was down there from August until December of 2001, and go into class one morning, and we have small groups, and they put you in with a bunch of your peers and teach in a kind of a collaborative effort, and we go in, turn CNN on the morning before we'd start class, just kind of catch up on what the day's news was, just keep us up on current events during the class. And saw the first tower go down and the second. And in the room with me are guys that are there from the 275. Good buddy of mine, John Litchfield, who's from Yukon, Oklahoma, was the support platoon leader for 2nd Ranger Battalion. Another good friend of mine that was there with me was from the Recon Marines. He was from Fort Worth, Texas, and we all three ran around together. And as soon as we saw what was happening and realized what it was, all the guys from the Ranger Battalion wanted to get up and go down to the compound there on Fort Benning, knocking on the gate, let us in. We know there's about to be something going on, and we don't want to be left out. And they said, no, go back to your unit. But I knew immediately, and I said to the guys in the room with me, as soon as the plane hit the second tower on the news there, I said, everything just changed, and we knew it was coming. So, I was there at the home of the infantry when that happened, and saw the buses leave from Fort Benning with the Ranger Battalion that was there at Fort Benning. I saw their buses drive out in the middle of the night about 3 nights later, and I knew that it was starting. They left under cover of darkness. I'm sure went and got on a plane somewhere and went to start training to start conducting missions. So I got back to Oklahoma, and almost immediately upon my return, got a call from the battalion executive officer for the 180th and said, hey, we got a notification we're going to go to Egypt to be the peacekeeping force on the multinational forces observer mission between Egypt and Israel. This is a peacekeeping mission that was established in the 70s by Carter as part of a plan to demilitarize the Sinai Peninsula and prevent any future conflict between Egypt and Israel there. And it's been real successful for several decades now.
Without regressing too much, it strikes me that was there a National Guard presence at the Oklahoma City bombings as well?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And were you involved in that as well?
I was at East Central going to college, and I had about an hour break between my 9 and 10 o'clock class. And I had come back to my room, flipped on the TV, and I had the news on like always, and was drinking some coffee, going to read up a little bit before the next class. And I got out of my 8:50 class, came in the room, turned on the TV, and saw the initial report that there's been an explosion in downtown, and they didn't know what it was. And then continued to watch it, and they figured out that it had been some sort of a bomb, and still didn't really understand what was going on, but understood that there was a lot of casualties and chaos in the downtown area. But me being from the southeastern part of the state, I wasn't really familiar with Oklahoma City or the area or what was going on up here. I just kept watching on the news, and the more I watched of it, I think I was probably a specialist or E5 at that time, E4, E5. I watched it and I knew that something significant had happened, and I kept watching, and I thought, man, maybe I ought to go in there and get my uniform on and go to the city. But as a young kid, I thought, I'm one of 3,000 in this in this infantry brigade here. All I'd do is go up there and be in the way.
Now,
So-
obviously, that was a domestic situation, and 9/11 was foreign. But were you reminded of that event during the time of 9/11?
Yeah, I was, and I immediately, as when the towers fell, I immediately began to wonder, was it foreign, was it domestic? I didn't initially just jump to this must be a terrorist attack from a jihadist movement somewhere. I thought, there's no telling what this could be. I guess that the Oklahoma City bombing here really made me not jump to the conclusion that some folks would at that time.
So during that time in the days right after 9/11, how did the military atmosphere change?
It was there was electricity in the air. You could absolutely tell. And of course, the Army being a large bureaucratic system like any other, there was a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction on the security. Our bases all immediately locked down. In the class that I was in, there were guys that that lived out in town and would come onto the post for class every day, and they would try to come in starting at 3:30 or 4:30 in the morning to get on to Fort Benning to report to PT and to go work out, run, whatever, and then come to class at 8 o'clock. And would get stuck in a line that was searching every vehicle from front to back and checking ID cards and all this. And to the point that we had a couple guys that would sit in line till 9, 10, 11, 12 o'clock, say, hey, my car's overheated, or I don't think I'm going to get in today. And the instructor would say, yeah, just go home, try again tomorrow. So the post's locked down. It's hard to get in and out. You could feel the tension that everybody was, angry, anxious, wondering what was going to happen next. A lot of the guys that were in the military were, hoping that whatever it was, something was going to be done soon, and they all wanted to be involved. They wanted to be able to contribute some way. And of course, at that time, like I'm saying, a lot of the guys that were in the captain's course with me that from the Special Operations Committee were wanting to go right back to their unit because they thought, we're going to go do something to squash where this came from, and it'll be over. It'll be a short duration, quick conflict, and they wanted to be back in their unit, not to miss out on that operation. And then, of course, at the time, we had no idea that we'd still be entangled in conflicts 10 years later.
Tell me a little bit about how you prepared to go to Egypt.
That was the first major deployment that was the first battalion-sized deployment that the Guard had since Korea. I don't think we took a full battalion to the Gulf War, and we were pretty rusty. We didn't really all of our war plans, all of our how do you go to war plans from the end of Korea all the way up to that mobilization were aligned with an active duty brigade or division, and we would essentially be sent in as a filler battalion or brigade into another active duty unit. And we had, plans that said this is how many rail cars it's going to take for us to put our stuff on, and we will rail load all of our stuff to a specific post. We'll do this many days of training on these specific tasks, and we'll go to war. So we got this not typical, atypical go to war mission to go be a peacekeeping force. It was nothing out of the playbook that we had. So, and at that time, everything was focused on ramping up for Iraq, for Afghanistan. Even then, Afghanistan was kind of a backwater fight. Not a lot of people knew about what was going on in Afghanistan, and Iraq was in the news. Iraq was the only thing you really heard a lot about. And really looking at the kind of the evolution of the Guard at that time, we had not been an operational force. We've been a strategic reserve. Our war plans were to go and back up an active duty division somewhere in a fight, or the national strategic plan at that time was that the active force could fight and win a war, and you could use the National Guard to sustain a second theater until, taking back the old Germany and Japan days, they said, well, we need a large enough strategic reserve that we could put one into a static conflict, dominate and win in the other theater, and then move that active force over and dominate and win in another theater at the same time. So we were the contingent for a second major theater of operations.
And was that second theater going to be Iraq?
Well, at that time, this didn't fit the model. That was the problem with Afghanistan and Iraq, and this whole thought process is that it didn't fit our old model of, major warfare, and to some extent you could still see that they were trying to do that. That the Army planners were trying to stick to that two theater war, but it was much more limited than they expected. But it was still real manpower intensive, and the Army had gone through the Clinton era cuts, and we were a smaller force then, just like we're talking about now. We're back on the other side of this pendulum today in 2014, talking about cutting the military back again.
Sounds like what you're describing as a logistical nightmare, basically.
Oh, it was. So we really, we didn't need much to conduct that mission as far as equipment and training. We were going to go stand in guard towers and report on the radio if we saw any vehicles drive by, things like that in Egypt. So we went to Fort Carson, Colorado, and the training program there for most of the units that were beginning to mobilize through Fort Carson were largely Iraq-based training, but they had a fairly specific training program for the MFO, the Multinational Force Observer Mission. It just wasn't real challenging. We joked around for our unit that they trained about, or that they had packed about 30 days of training into a 90-day span. So we did a lot of looking for our own training, a lot of sitting around, a lot of waiting, and the training programs weren't great, but they were trying to improve with what they had. And that was the famous Rumsfeld quote from the time that was very accurate. You don't go to war with the army you want, you go to war with the army you have. So we went to Egypt. It was a fairly uneventful deployment.
Was there a social atmosphere of unrest going on?
In Egypt, not really. Very limited. That I could tell in Egypt at the time. Having not known a whole lot about the country's government before I arrived, that it was a police state. They were very much, especially in the Sinai Peninsula, which was a big tourist area. They were very much under the control of Hosni Mubarak and the military, and any kind of unrest was just stopped immediately. They would arrest anyone that was outspoken or were conducting anything that even looked odd there on the peninsula, because it was bringing in $1 million a year in the tourist industry. It was a resort town. There were always Russian and Italian tourists there. Scuba diving and deep sea diving were big there in the Red Sea, because the water there is beautiful. I tell everybody it looked like a bathtub. It was so blue and clear and so beautiful fish and all that. But, which a lot of the soldiers enjoyed that and had a good time there. Being a company commander, I spent most of my time trying to keep soldiers out of trouble there. Being a military force in a resort town on the first deployment they've ever done overseas. A lot of Oklahoma kids that had gone overseas for the first time, and they show up in a resort town and are told to, when you guys get out there in this resort town, act right. And so I had a full-time job there, just kind of herding cats.
How long were you in Egypt?
We got to Egypt in January of 2002 and redeployed back to the United States in in July of 2002. No, that's not right. We got to, I'll have to stop and look at my notes. What year did we go to Egypt? Yeah, January through July of 2003. Sorry.
Okay, so
January
2003. This is getting up to the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, well, actually, we were while we were in Egypt. We had these little 2-man trailers. Me and a couple of other company commanders along the beach there. The battalion commander was on our little camp, and I could see. We would sit out in the evening and watch Tomahawk missiles being launched out of the bay, out of the Red Sea, to the north up toward Iraq. So we could see the fight going on. We'd see the KC-130 refuel aircraft and see the ships out in the harbor. Actually, the kind of cool thing for me, again, for me, just kind of being in the right place at the right time. President Bush came for the Arab Summit there in Sharm el-Sheikh, where we were while we were there, and my company ended up pulling security for Air Force One, providing a QRF for the presidential detail, and then I got to go ride in the presidential convoy and basically serve as a sweeper along the route, telling me how the route's good, everything looks like it. They want a local there to kind of tell them what everything looked like. So got to meet the president and saw all the key players back in those days. Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice and Harry Schweitzer and those guys all came to Egypt. I got to run around like I was somebody for a day or two and had a good time with it.
What were your impressions of the president?
Oh, it was strictly business for me. I was running around with a bunch of Secret Service guys trying to look serious. No, not really any interaction at all.
Right.
I had a job to do, so I'd try to take a quick snapshot or something once in a while if I had a chance, but that was about it. But taller than I expected.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So take us back to the stateside and then upon your deployment to Iraq.
It was a quick turnaround for me. I was home 19 days between, I went to Afghanistan next. While we were in Egypt, the commanding general, General Mancino for the 45th Brigade, came to Afghanistan to Egypt to talk to the officers and senior NCOs from the task force and to do a site visit there. And what was happening in the Army at that time, they had deployed the Guard here in this battalion-sized peacekeeping operation, but they figured out that the fight in Iraq was so manpower intensive. You need so many people to clear and hold a country of that size with a population of that size, with large city-based populations. That in Iraq there aren't people scattered out across the countryside because it's desertous. It's all real barren, and the people live along the rivers and in the big cities. As opposed to Afghanistan, where it's a much more spread out rural culture. And in that urban environment, it took such a massive amount of manpower. The Army was quickly realizing we're going to need more folks to be in this fight to be successful in Iraq. So they pitched to the 45th the Task Force Phoenix mission, which was the training mission for the Afghan National Army. And we got that mission, accepted it. So General Mancino came to Egypt for his site visit and then pitched to us company commanders, first sergeants, platoon sergeants. He said, hey, we need captains and senior NCOs to go to Afghanistan on this deployment that's coming up in the next few months to train the Afghan Army. And that's about all we got. That's all we knew what was going on. Go train the Afghan Army. At that time, the war in Afghanistan was very small. There were probably at that time less than 20,000 people in the country, which is about the size of Bagram Air Base now or something. There were more people there on that one base now than there were in the entire country at that time. It was a very small operation. It was the other war. We kind of joked around, So we all talked it over, and a few of us agreed, yeah, we ought to go do that. And largely loyalty to the infantry brigade is what drew us to that. Loyalty to the 45th, and anybody that knows Oklahoma knows anything about the 45th kind of understands why that exists with soldiers and citizens that live here. Is that their history in World War II, history in Korea, and even why they had picked the 45th to go on that Task Force Phoenix mission. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. I came home. I was home, like I said, 19 days between those two deployments, and then turned around and went back to Fort Carson, Colorado to train up for the trip to Afghanistan.
Were you married during this time?
I got married. Actually, got married between the two deployments, between
Really?
Egypt and Afghanistan. I'd been dating a girl, and we got married. And essentially, not knowing a lot about the conflict, it kind of sounds morbid, but I thought, well, if I get to Afghanistan and get killed, somebody ought to get my life insurance out of this deal. So I got married and said, I'll see you in a year, and went off to Afghanistan.
Not much of a honeymoon in
Not much of a
Afghanistan.
honeymoon, no. And again, when I got back to Fort Carson so then that was October time frame. I went up that, so I go back to Fort Carson to mobilize for my second deployment. And the Army's machine, the training was all still focused very much on Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
Every briefing that we went in sit in and to learn country briefings, etc. They'd say, when you get to Iraq, we'd raise our hand and say, auditorium full of captains and majors and colonels sitting around. They said, when you guys get to Iraq, we're going to Afghanistan. Oh, well, it's the same thing. And then they give us the same country brief, watch out for these poisonous snakes. This is the language. This is how you say hello, etc. It was all wrong. Mm-hmm. The specialized training for Afghanistan wasn't there. And we still had a lot of our old equipment even. I tell everybody, I spent $2,000 on equipment to go to Afghanistan. We had a State Department guy come and give us a briefing on a kind of a better country briefing on Afghanistan, and open it up for questions about what we would be doing. And when we ask about our ability to influence the Afghans' decision making, what authority do we have, some of the rules of engagement about can we fight, do we shoot, do we not, the answer was always, well, we don't really know. And while we were training up, there was a task force in place. The 10th Mountain Division had formed a training task force and called them Task Force Phoenix 1. And they had a 6-month time period where they began to stand up the Afghan army. But they really had just kind of put a structure in place, and they had filled with some reserve officers and some guard officers and some of their own force to kind of stand up this task force. But they hadn't taken that Afghan army had not gone out of the Kabul area yet. That Kabul was the center of where the army was at that time. So we were building an army from scratch there, and we came in at the 6-month mark and took over with the 45th, taking over Task Force Phoenix.
So in this advisor role, were you training in counterinsurgency, urban warfare? What was the tactics like?
Well, that's a good question, and the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
we really had a whole lot of freedom to do whatever we thought we needed to. So it was coming in cold, and like I said, with every bit of the pre-mobilization training being us being told we're not really sure. At one point we were told, you'll stay in Kabul at the military training center, you'll train these units, then you'll send them off to an ODA, to a special forces team who will go downrange with them and conduct operations with them, and then they'll send them back to you. And I said, so you're telling me I'm going to train this unit, live with them every day, train them, teach them how to fight, run them through battle drills, etc., and then I'm going to hand them off to a guy, some SF guy's going to come and say thanks, and then he's going to come back to me in 3 or 4 weeks with a list, said, hey, could you have them work on react to contact a little? I said, that's one, that's not going to work, and two, there's no way that's the way this is going to really happen. Mm-hmm. But we kept being told that, you're not going to fight with them, you're just going to train them. But like I said, we all could tell the way it was shaping up there that was not going to be the case, that we were going to live with, train with and fight with these guys, and that's what ended up happening. So some of the structure of Task Force Phoenix at that time, we were training essentially an Afghan brigade, which is about, over there it was a little bigger than 3,000. I'm sorry, corps. We had 3 brigades there, which would have been about 9,000 soldiers roughly at the time, and it was growing every day. So Oklahoma having an infantry brigade here, we could mirror their leadership 1 for 1. Okay. With our entire brigade to brigade, but we needed 2 more brigades to round out all of the training mission. So we pulled from the Vermont National Guard and the South Carolina National Guard to train those other 2 brigades. Mm-hmm. So Oklahoma, under General Mancino, had the Task Force Phoenix Command, the Task Force Phoenix staff there at Camp Phoenix in Kabul, and then they manned one of the training brigades for the Afghan Army, and Vermont took the 2nd Training Brigade, and South Carolina took the 3rd Training Brigade. And so those 3 brigades were all there were at the Afghan Army at that time in 2003.
I'm interested in the name Phoenix. Of course, in Vietnam there was a Phoenix program. Is there a connection there?
No, this was symbolically. This was the Afghan army rising from the ashes and being recreated as something stronger, a professional army that could defend their free nation. Was our intent there.
Certainly coincidental.
Yeah, very coincidental, and also good press for the 45th, which has a phoenix for their emblem.
Okay. Yeah.
So when we mobilized there, all of us that had volunteered from Egypt to go on the Phoenix 2 mission, which we were the second iteration. They were behind Task Force or behind 10th Mountain, so we were Phoenix 2. We all were attached over to the Vermont Guard to help round out their brigade task force. So I ended up falling under a gentleman by the name of Rob Charlesworth, who was a major at the time, as my team chief, and working with Vermont National Guard, which was a godsend for me because those guys were very professional soldiers, great at small group tactics. Vermont runs the Mountain Warfare Training Center up in Vermont, which is it's a National Guard school, but it's also where all the special operations and all those, every unit in the Army sends their folks to the Mountain Warfare Training Center to learn cold weather survival and mountain warfare. So here I show up in Afghanistan and get attached immediately to a team of guys who come from mountain warfare training. And they taught me a lot about how to survive in the mountains, what kind of clothes to wear to stay warm, etc. And off we went. Our task force loads up, starts flying to Afghanistan, and we get almost to Afghanistan to our first staging base in Kyrgyzstan. And I'm met on the tarmac by a friend of mine from OBC, which tells you how small the Guard is. And before they could get us all into the first building there to in process into Kyrgyzstan, our brigade commander comes over and says to my team chief, Charlesworth, your team's got to get back on the next bird that goes out to get in country because your battalion is deploying. So they wanted to get us linked up with our Afghan Kandak, what it's called there, our Afghan Kandak or battalion. So we shot straight into country and were immediately deployed out of the area. And then I spent the next 10 or 11 months roaming all over Afghanistan there.
So tell me about your baptism in fire.
Well, that didn't come for a long time. And the way I was welcomed to Afghanistan was probably the perfect way to kind of get somebody trained on how to survive there. Flying in that first night into Afghanistan, in the dark on a C-130, bouncing up and down and flying nap of the earth over those mountains, coming over the top of the Hindu Kush Mountains into Bagram airfield there, which is on the north side of Kabul. It's dark, and I just had all these visions of, the plane's gonna get shot at, and it's gonna be real exciting, crazy stuff because I'm flying in the war zone for the first time. But it was pretty uneventful other than that, rough, kind of exciting plane ride. And we hit the ground in the middle of the night and get to Bagram. Next day we jump in Ford Ranger pickups. We had these soft skin pickups. We didn't have any armor at the time. We had all bought some of the police second chance armor, and we're taping it to the inside of the doors of the trucks and putting sandbags on the floors of the truck. As I said, we called ourselves the poor man's special forces because we were out doing crazy things that no National Guard unit ever thought they would do with no resources.
You mentioned sandbags. Was there a fear of IEDs?
Yeah. We were, the IED threat was so great in Iraq at that time that we were waiting for that technology to filter over to the other, or that TTP, that technique to trickle over to the other theater. And that's kind of what you would see. If something new would happen in Iraq, they would learn a new technique or a new way to fight or a new technology, and then it would slowly kind of build its way over toward us. But then also in Afghanistan, the difference there in the terrain and the cultures is every valley over there has really a different fight. You know, you can have a certain way that things are fought against you in one valley and go 1 or 2 valleys over and they'll do something completely different. So it's really a real specific by site.
It sounds like a lot of on-the-job training.
Absolutely, yeah. You had to be real adaptive. Learn it as you go. There was no playbook for what we were doing there.
Mm-hmm.
The Army was really small there again in Iraq or in Afghanistan. Iraq was the main effort for the fight. We, like I said, you know, I was buying my own equipment. We were making do with what we had. And then part of that training model, they told us, you know, you'll train the Afghans and then give them to a special forces task force to conduct training with or to conduct combat operations with. Luckily, we did have a lot of the special forces guys, the SF groups around that would essentially give us handouts. Here's some ammo, here's some food, here's whatever you need, here's some radio batteries, whatever we needed to survive. Because we were really, once you left Kabul, left the capital, and went outside of that kind of the built up area for the Army, you fell off the net. You know, you're just gone from, you know, nobody. It was hard for them anyway to know where we were, what we were doing, stay in contact with us, and certainly to support us logistically was almost non-existent.
How did you communicate back home during that time in Afghanistan?
Well, so that's the part that's not nearly as bad as it sounds. We had a TACSAT radio and a sat phone. We had one sat phone for our team, and every once in a while we would pull that sat phone out when we were all in the same place and call home on it. And then every once in a while I'd be able to get on somewhere that had email when I would come into a base. The kind of chronology of that deployment to Afghanistan, I fell in as the first company, first Kandak, which our first battalion, 2nd Brigade, Afghan Army, as a trainer. So I was an advisor to another captain. Nazir Khan was his name. And Nazir was a Pashtun guy that was an educated fella. His son was an interpreter. He spoke a little English. His son spoke quite a bit of English. His son worked for another company in our brigade there. And that battalion was made up primarily of Tajik officers who had been part of the Northern Alliance. And as Northern Alliance guys and Tajiks, they were very, you know, the Army was still pretty ethnically controlled by the Tajiks there in Afghanistan, and probably still is today. But they chose our battalion a lot for high-profile missions because of who the leadership was. The battalion commander was an Uzbek guy who was an older fella that really wasn't, he was sort of a figurehead. Mm-hmm. But the battalion XO had been Massoud's envoy to Karzai. So he was a politically connected and probably one of the smartest men I've ever met in my life. An Afghan guy, great big fella named, we called him Habib, which just means friend in Arabic. But Habib, great big guy, never carried a weapon, went anywhere in the country that he wanted to without any fear from anybody, you know. But he was one of those kind of folks that really dominated the room. He walked in just with his presence and his physical stature and his intellect. You could tell he was just a smart man and real gentle when he needed to be. So that battalion got the first battalion-sized mission outside of Kabul. They said, okay, we're going to start flexing the muscle of the Afghan Army. We're going to let people see who these guys are. And the first push was that Kandak going up to the northern part of the country to Mazar-i-Sharif, which was a very pro-America, pro-Northern Alliance, anti-Taliban area. And we were overseeing the turn-in of heavy weapons there between two of the major warlords. Dostum and Ada were two of the key players up there, and they both had old tanks and old artillery pieces, and they had their own militia of arms up there, and the central government wanted them to turn that stuff in. So with an ODA team, a SF team up there running the operation, and us up there providing manpower to guard the camps and generally have a presence of the Afghan Army there, we sat on those sites from November through January and kind of supervised the turn-in process between Dost and Minata.
Were these former Soviet weapons?
Yeah, all Soviet stuff. Yeah, a lot of D-30s and T-72 tanks, T-60 tanks, the old Soviet, Cold War era weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they would try to turn into us the junkiest stuff they had. They'd say, there was a schedule of turn-in. General Dostrom, you're supposed to turn in this many weapons. And he'd find we need 10 D-30s from you because we know you got them. And we need X number on this day, X number in this month. And so we'd start with, they'd find whatever junk they could drag to the truck into the junk pile.
So for the general public who don't really understand the tribal diversity in Afghanistan, can you give us a background on that? Talk about the warlordships?
Yeah, I'll try to give you a brief explanation there. The two major ethnic groups are the Tajiks and Pashtuns. The Pashtuns being the more native historic population. If you looked at Oklahoma, that would be the Native Americans that were living here centuries before anybody came. The Tajiks were at one time the remnants of the Persian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
They spoke the Persian language. They spoke Farsi, which over time being separated from Iran became kind of its own dialect, and they call it Dari there now. And they were the descendants of the provincial governors and the local leaders that were put in place by the Persians to control Afghanistan when it became a territory of theirs.
Mm-hmm.
And as such, the Pashtuns see the Tajiks, who settled primarily in the north in the largely Persian-controlled areas from the old empire. The Pashtuns see those Tajiks as outsiders who don't really own that land and
Mm-hmm.
who are squatting on land that was theirs for centuries before they came.
Right.
And then the Tajiks see the Pashtuns as a backwater tribal culture that has no business up there in the land that their ancestors conquered.
Right.
So you kind of have these opposing views of who Afghanistan belongs to, and this kind of a long-standing cultural distrust between the two. Some other major players as far as ethnicities go there is the Hazaras. The Hazaras were slaves up until the 1800s, were treated as slaves, and you could own Hazara slaves in the country. And the Hazara is the Farsi or Dari word for 1,000. Genghis Khan came through there and conquered the area and left a 1,000-man outpost in Afghanistan. And the locals in Afghanistan began to refer to those guys in that 1,000-man outpost that Genghis Khan left up in the north end of the Bagram Valley as the 1,000. Those, the 1,000 guys that left up here.
Mm-hmm.
And the Yak Hazar, it would be. So they started calling them Hazara. The Hazara up there are the remnants of Genghis Khan's conquest of Afghanistan. And you can look at them. They're very determinedly Asian people. They
Mm-hmm.
look much more Chinese than they do Afghan.
Mm-hmm.
Even to the point that when I had a Hazara interpreter that went up to Mazar-i-Sharif with us, and if you go back and look at the Taliban occupation in Mazar-i-Sharif, they slaughtered the Hazaras by the thousands. They were trying to exterminate them from that area through genocide. And my interpreter up there, when he was with us out in town and in Mazar-i-Sharif and in the north, he would always wear sunglasses because he didn't want them to see his eyes. He didn't want to see his eyes were ethnic Asian looking. And then the Nuristanis, the Nuris, there's kind of a common, really, I think it's been disproven as of late, but the belief at the time were the Nuris were the kind of the leftovers of Alexander's army, because they were you or I could almost pass for a Nuristani if we'd grow our beard out and put on the right clothes, because they were very white, Caucasian-looking people. They spoke their own language. I had a Nuristani soldier in my company there on the first deployment, and I spoke pretty good Dari, so I'd have to speak to another guy who spoke Dari and Pashtun, to another soldier that I had that spoke only Pashtun and Nuristani a little. So even to ask the kid, where are you from, it took me 2 interpreters to get around to him. So language was a barrier with them.
Absolutely.
But they lived up in the mountains, in the foothills of the Hindu Kush Mountains. You know, for some places the valleys were at 6,000 to 8,000 feet. You'd have 12,000 feet peaks there. Really beautiful, you know, cedar-covered mountains, fresh water, but very backwoods, isolated from society, tribal region that had been untouched by anybody else in a long time. And they were called Nuristanis because Nur is the word for light. And when the Muslim conquest of that area took place, they said that they had spread the light of Islam across those people, and they called that, you know, the Nur, the Nuristani. That they had been spread, the light of Islam had been spread across them. But there were still a lot that had some kind of native or more naturalist ways of belief, you know, like spirits in the trees kind of stuff.
Right.
But real ethnic diversity there, and ethnicity was still one of the major factors in how they related to each other. It was in a very tribal and very family based culture. It's about who's your family, what's your tribe, what area you're from, and then what nationality are you. So the concept of being an Afghan is much lower on their priority list as it is to us as being an American.
Right.
You know, they would identify much more closely with their family, with their religion, with their tribe, with their tribal network, and then with their nation.
Now, of those different ethnicities, which ones were pro-Western, if you will?
Well, you know, historically the Northern Alliance had been, and that's a complicated subject. You know, essentially the Durand Line separated Pakistan and Afghanistan with an arbitrary line in the sand or across the mountains there that said, you know, and it's the same battle that you're seeing all over the world in the last 50 years. It's just post-imperial British colonialism has fallen apart, and now a lot of cultures and ethnic groups are trying to define their own boundaries, not those that an outside superpower has put on them.
Right.
And that's the conflict that's happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan today. Is Afghanistan is the boundary between two nations, you know, or it's a boundary across one nation, really, because the Pashtun tribes that see themselves as a big network of tribes that belong to one nation have been divided by a line. But to give the Pashtuns a land, Pashtunistan I would call it, would take so much land and political power and control away from Pakistan and destabilize Pakistan so much that it's not beneficial for Pakistan to lose Pashtun, the Pashtun areas, the Northwest Tribal area they call it. But the Tajiks in the north, having been much more under a more modern influence of the Soviet era, and seen as the outsiders by the Pashtuns, lean more toward supporting the West when it's beneficial, because it keeps their control of the areas that are theirs now. And they didn't buy into radical Islam as much as the Pashtuns did. And there's a little bit of writing about that, about Pashtun Wali, which is their tribal culture, their tribal laws in the Pashtun tribes, and radical Islam just fit well together. It was kind of the perfect storm. You know, Pashtun Wali is this tribal culture that says if you dishonor me or my family, you know, I can declare a foul or a war against your family. You know, it's all about retribution and respect, and that lent itself well to the things that were being taught by the folks that came over from Saudi Arabia and the other Arab countries when they started to fight the Soviets, and the Taliban grew out of that.
Okay. And how did that diversity or the dynamics of that affect the Afghan forces under your leadership?
It was complicated, and ethnicity was always something to be considered when you were dealing with tribes or with the military, or the one thing that I would always tell my soldiers later on in Afghanistan, after I started to kind of understand the culture there at the very base level, is that young Americans would make the assumption that they weren't intelligent because they couldn't read or write, or because they didn't have running water in their house. And I tell them, we spend our entire youth, our young adulthood, learning how to read and write, learning, in institutions of education. They spend their entire young life learning how to survive. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones that grow up to be in positions of power, to have influence, or survivors, and they're intelligent. And don't always take what you see on the surface to be their only motivation for something. Mm-hmm. We joked around about kind of the dynamics that were at play there a lot as being a combination of Mad Max, rolling across the desert and in a sparse, crazy environment, meets The Sopranos. So, because there's always some kind of political intrigue going on behind the scenes that you didn't often see. In the Kandak or battalion that I was assigned to mentor, train, advise, combat advisor, whatever you want to call it these days, what we really did. I had largely Tajik officer population, and I had the rarity of having a mostly ethnic Pashtun soldiers, but they were good soldiers. They were hard fighters, and they were dedicated. The group of Afghans that we had in our Kandak, in our battalion there at the time, had come through the Kabul Military Training Institute, which we stood up to train the Afghan soldiers, and the Special Forces started that training process with them as part of their foreign internal defense mission. They numbered classes, and my guys were in the 4th cohort to come through the training institute. So they had all shown up to the Afghan army almost immediately upon its inception and said, "Yeah, I want to be in the Afghan army. I want to defend this nation." They were staunchly anti-Taliban, liberated Afghanistan. They wanted to be there, and they wanted to be part of that culture. What you saw later in the war, and what's happening a lot, that you see high-profile attacks that happen by insider threats in the news in the last 4 to 5 years, is us going out and thinking that the Afghan army needs to be this huge organization, and going out and asking people to join the Taliban. The Taliban have kind of exploited that by sending their own people in to join, or people who've had their opinion of us swayed over the years by some of the mistakes that the Afghan or the American army had made over time. And what we had then was a much more loyal force, but it was largely Tajik controlled, and the Pashtuns were sometimes distrusted just for their ethnicity. And same with the Hazara soldiers. The Hazara soldiers, it was rare to see a Hazara officer. There were a few around, and the Hazara soldiers too, you had to watch to make sure that there wasn't mistreatment, coercion, taking their pay, things like that weren't being done.
Interesting. So, were there any memorable events, episodes where these dynamics played out?
Lots of nuances, a lot of small things. Not anything that was ever just a blatant show of one ethnic group against another. They stayed somewhat segregated even within the forces at that time in the Army, and they tried to keep all that under control, under wraps. Even at the in the Afghan Army, their leadership tried to keep peace between the ethnic groups, and there was some pretty open campaigns on it that we were pushing, and that the Afghans were pushing as well, saying, this is an army for the entire nation. It's going to be ethnically diverse, and they were trying to overcome that history, which just like you see in America, it's not something that gets better overnight. It just takes time and education.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, and especially with the Oklahoma National Guard. So, can you talk about the demography of the Oklahoma National Guard?
How we are in the state?
Right. Well, I mean, as far as the population in the National Guard in Afghanistan. What was the demographic like?
Oh well, you know, we were largely separated from the rest of the force there, and as far as the Oklahomans, not a lot of people knew who we were or what we were doing there. Because, like I said, we were spread out all over the country and in little backwater places all over the place. The Afghans were really impressed with any of our talk about Native Americans. They were interested in and knew, you know, a lot of times I would run into villages and they'd ask me if I was a Russian because they had never seen an American before. But when you would say something to the Afghan soldiers about American Indians, they would get curious and they would ask you about it, and they knew some about it. You know, that tribal nature has a connection with them, and they see, you know, the same thing here as they see this as the underdog facing a larger oppressor, which was really ingrained in them with Russia, and they identified with that. So if we ever had, and I you know, I'm part Cherokee myself, that never got documented because my grandmother distrusted anybody that said, come get in line and show us that you're Native American. Mm-hmm. It was the last time that happened in Alabama. They took their land away from them. Mm-hmm. But when I told them that I was Cherokee, when they stopped laughing about a parody about it, that they thought that was pretty interesting. The laugh that they got was that the Afghan word for backpack, or I'm sorry, sleeping bag, is Cherokee. Mm-hmm. So when I told them that my Indian tribe in America was Cherokee, they thought that was pretty funny. We're from the sleeping bag tribe.
That's interesting.
But they did identify real quickly with the Native Americans, especially the guys from Oklahoma that were very visibly Indian. They could look at you and go, "Hey, you're not white. What are you?" And they tell them they're very interested in, And we had on a later deployment, we had Sergeant Henry was big Indian guy from Oklahoma, and good guy, great NCO, and they always told him that he could stay and be the Pashtun tribal leader because he looked like he could stay there and be one of them,
Interesting.
Yeah, and he also was pretty influential with them because they liked him for that.
Now, in your role as an advisor, you probably didn't interact with civilians much.
Yeah, I did a lot.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I did. That job, like I said, we were out. We were given some real vague guidelines. Here's what we want you to go do, and go get after it. And one, being out on our own and really kind of having to decide how to proceed in our area, how to survive, and then taking cues from the Afghans sometime, which was a key that we were pushing with my team. And like I said, with Rob Charlesworth, my team leader, was a real intelligent guy at the time, to further progress there outside of the guidance that we've been given. Let's go down to the local village and sit down and talk with them, introduce them to the Afghan army. Not really from my standpoint, but I'll throw in a pitch about why am I here too. We were trying to build trust and confidence in the locals around us. So really, more than an advisor on a daily basis there, I went from being to being a base defense planner, to being a company commander, to being a squad leader, to being a city planner. And we would go sit down with the local village leaders and say, hey, here's who we are. This is the Afghan army. They had never seen the Afghan army before, didn't know who they were, what they were there for. And they would tell them about the Afghan army, maybe even throw a little recruiting spiel in there and say, if you have any sons that want to come and join the army and defend Afghanistan for your tribe's right to be part of the new government, then send them. And they bring them in. So we've got Tajik soldiers, we've got Pashtun soldiers, we've got Hazara soldiers, and then I'd say, we're the Americans, and we're here to ensure that your country has the opportunity to build its own government and determine its own future, not with the outside influence of another nation or a minority group that wants to control the entire country. We want you to have your own self-determination.
So what were some of the successes and failures of those interactions with tribal leaders?
At that point, they were so standoffish with us, and they didn't, they were really wary of us and didn't know what we were doing or how long we would be there. Were we going to be an occupying force or not? And poor country was such a small amount of health and nutrition and child care and prenatal care that the infant mortality rate's high, their rate from disease of very curable standards is high. So most of the time when I interacted with villagers and village elders there, the things that they would ask for are clinic. They want school. They want a clinic. They need medical supplies. They want fresh water. And those were always we got the same spiel there. It's I want medical care. I want water. And then we don't need security. We can secure ourselves. We don't need roads. We'll figure that out later. We need the basic necessities at the time. That's what we got for a long time. And later things, greed and complexity take over in the theater, and the Army got bigger in theater, and there were more people all over the place trying to do things to be helpful that sometimes weren't. We would dig a well every 100 feet because we had another well project to do, and it was one organization not talking to the other, and a series of what I talk about our 1-year wars. We fought a series of 1-year wars because you'd go for 12 months and go home. Some guy would take your place. He wasn't familiar with the area, didn't know what you'd accomplished, didn't understand maybe the dynamics of the area, and we did a poor job of compiling a history of what was happening with a long-term goal of what we were going to achieve when we were there, determine an end state, and recognize it when we get to it. So we spent a lot of time trying to meet basic needs, and really at that point just trying to determine basic needs in that first deployment.
So during your first deployment, did you experience combat?
Yeah, we were, it was a lot of low intensity ambushes, firefights, things of that nature, which I say low intensity. It's always intense when the bullet's coming at you. But yeah, I had one IED go off close to my truck. I was in the back of a open, called an LMTV, and peppered our truck with shrapnel. And I jumped out and basically rounded up all the village elders that were in the village there and said, "Hey, do you know who did this?" "No, we didn't see anything. Nobody knows anything." I told them, I said, a few months from now I'll go back to America and I'll raise my kids and live in peace. I said, I know you guys know nobody's going to blow up an IED in your village and you not know about it. I said, I know you guys know what's going on here. I said, you can live here in conflict for the next century, or you can tell your kids not to try to blow us up. That the only thing we're here to do is try to provide you with the basic service I was talking about, and the peace to provide them in. But I don't know that they ever bought into any of what we were telling them. One of my funniest and probably most intense was I got in a near ambush with some of my guys one night. We were going on a little raid there, and I kind of downplayed some of the shooting stuff back in those days, because after going 2 more times, I've been in lots of firefights and lots of explosions, and it kind of it's real intense when it happens, but after you do it for about 3 different tours, it kind of becomes run of the mill. I kind of, on the last deployment especially, I really kind of felt like I had an extra sense. I knew when bad stuff was going to happen, and that's not to say that I couldn't walk around a corner and get run over by a truck anytime, or get shot or whatever. But I kind of developed this sense to know, just as if you think about, if you grew up in Oklahoma City and you know what the bad part of town is, and you kind of know when something's going on in the bad part of town. I was there enough to kind of get that sense of what was going on. So yeah, it was all crazy and exciting and adrenaline rush and all that, but kind of got used to it.
Can you take us through the circumstances of a combat situation?
Yeah, well, that little near ambush we got in, we had air assaulted into a village, and I'll finish this up with how we won the war that month. We had air assaulted into a village, had flown in helicopters, got out and secured the local area, and it was we were in Zabul province, Afghanistan, in a village called Afghan, a little valley up kind of northwest of Kandahar, and we were doing security for polling and election sites for their first free election. And because we were the first Americans to go into that area, in an area that had been largely unseen before, we were immediately met with people that wanted to tell us stuff about the Taliban in that area. There are Taliban guys here doing this and that. And this was part of a major operation that was kind of a hammer and anvil push to get the Taliban pushed toward the border, out of the area, and trapped by another task force. It was kind of the hammer of the thing. Mm-hmm. And then while we were there, then we would stop on these polling and election sites and provide security. So we land 2 companies of Afghans and a company from the 3rd to the 25th ID by Chinook up there in the valley. And we were there, the first night we were there, I think we had some sporadic grazing fire. We had moved into the town and there was no police center there, like just a big mud wall area with towers in the corners. And we went in and occupied that because immediately the police left the town and had these old Toyota police trucks that the 10th Mountain guys had given them, donated to them to be the police force's trucks. And the police took off out of town, and they immediately, when we got there, which didn't make sense, so they immediately said, hey, the police in this area are all Taliban. Those guys pulled the wool over the eyes of the dudes that were here before you down at Kandahar, talked them into giving them these trucks, but it's all with Taliban guys running around using these police trucks for their combat operations. So we occupied their police center and just lived in it while we were there and started conducting operations out there. So the first night they started shooting at us with PKMs, automatic machine guns, and some AKs fired. I think one RPG hit the wall of the compound. So we got up and returned fire and kind of tried to get around the village to see where they were going to chase them off. We didn't have any vehicles then to be able to chase them in, you know. So it's just kind of, we're just playing cops and robbers up there on foot for a little while with these guys since we'd flown in. So the next day we go about trying to procure vehicles. We got a motorcycle from one village elder. One of my guys, John Digby, was riding a motorcycle around a little bit. Sold a little Chinese-looking cheap motorcycle. Charlesworth went down and rented with some cash a little Toyota Corolla, little junky-looking Toyota Corolla from another guy. So you can imagine this little Toyota Corolla going down these mountain trails, and then the day after, we came across one of those Toyota pickups abandoned in the middle of the road on the side of a mountain on a trail. And I sent some of my Afghans up to clear it and make sure there wasn't nothing in it. And I started driving that for my vehicle, driving around the valley in that thing. So a couple nights later, we got some pretty good intel on a local guy that we'd been looking for, Mullah Hakim, I think was his name. We heard that he was in a village not far down the mountain. And we were going to try to go down there and essentially see if we could sneak up there and nab the guy. And so we took a convoy with some of my Afghans, Rob Charlesworth in the Corolla behind me, and Digby behind him in another Corolla that we'd come up with. And then back behind us was the 325, the 25th ID. Of course, I'm driving, have my night vision goggles on, and I've got a truckload of Afghans with me. Jawed was the XO for my company sitting in this seat. And then I got a whole truck bed full. Where down we go through the mountains, riding over the bumps in the mountains, and I'm trying to drive with this monocular night vision goggle on. And then finally we're driving on this bumpy dirt road in the dark. Finally the Afghans in front of me decided that they couldn't see well enough by the moonlight. They had to turn on their headlights. So now I'm blinded by my night vision goggle. And we haven't gone more than about 2 miles south of our CAC Afghan village to try to get down to this next village to see if we can sneak up on this guy. And I'm blinded now, so I flip my night vision goggles up and have to turn on my white headlights too so I can see, because now they've blinded me. And we go about 300 yards like that, and it's kind of an odd light the first time, but I see this light off to my left, and it's getting brighter like somebody's shining a flashlight or something. I look over and I see, it's one of those happens in slow motion things, but I swear I could see the head of this RPG coming at me real slow like this. And so as I'm on the trail, there's a rock face here, and kind of a slope down to about 50 meters away. There's a river down here, a little riverbed, and I see RPG come right in front of the little Toyota truck that I'm in on this side, and then another one kind of lights up behind me and goes right over the back of my truck between me and Charlesworth behind me. And boom, boom, these two RPGs hit on both ends of my truck. And then a couple of, the fire opens up along the riverbank there, PKMs and AK-47s and whatnot. And my Afghans just bail everywhere. Truck in front of me stops and they all bail out and hit the ground, get down and play on the ground. And I'm sitting there in the truck with my gear on and driving, my helmet with my night vision goggles flipped up so they're rubbing the top of the seat, and I'm in a truck that's on the steering wheel's on the other side like a British truck. So I'm driving on this side of the truck. Jawed, my XO, has jumped out and left the door open. I can just see muzzle flashes down there about 50 meters from me. These AK-47 stuff going off, PKM going off, and hear ting, 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 pop, pop, pop all around me, hear bullets whizzing by. And I'm trying to get this latch open on this Toyota, which the door latch was gone, and it was just a little metal hook that sticks out where the door latch is supposed to be, and it's stuck. So I hit it and bump, look over, hit it and bump and look, and it seemed like an eternity for me of pulling that little hook and trying to ram that door open with the intent of getting over behind the engine block so I wasn't going to get shot. Of course, I've got no plates on the side, so I felt pretty exposed there for a minute. Finally got that thing knocked open, knocked my helmet off, get down behind the engine block, look up over and start returning fire a little and see the Afghan first sergeant from my company by the time I had been able to get myself out of the truck and behind the engine block, and I see him. Nurullah was his name, the light of God. Nurullah was a big Afghan, burly-looking, mean-looking guy that even the American soldiers were afraid of. And he comes walking down the road that we were on with guns firing on both sides of him, and he's yelling at soldiers and saying, "Hey, you, look out, move over here," whatever, like it was no big deal. He'd been a smuggler during the Taliban era, smuggling people across the border from Pakistan to Iran, back and forth, and was a pretty rough fella. And, we all joked around that he'd probably killed more people than polio, Nurullah had. He was a rough guy and showed absolutely no fear. So by that time, I kind of got my blood pressure back down, that I'd gotten out of the truck and I was okay, and our volume of fire was starting to pick up, so we were starting to kind of dominate the fight. And I saw around the corner of my truck, I saw one of my Afghan soldiers laying on the ground behind a little rock, shooting like this without looking, right over the top of one of his buddies' heads. And I thought, man, he's about to shoot him, So I jumped up, went over there and grabbed him and said, "Hey, and Dari said, "How do they make them?" I was like, don't shoot over your buddy's head, you're going to shoot him, So then I'm up moving around. I thought, well, I better go, my immediate little tactical sense is ambush is coming from that way. Our trucks have stopped on both ends. Now we can't move. If I was that guy down there, I would flank around to our side. So I grabbed a couple of Afghans and I said, "Go up there and watch the front side of our convoy. Set up, don't let them flank us up there." Which luckily, in the few months I'd been there, I'd started learning tactical terms to be able to explain to them for this kind of situation. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to be able to say, "Hold on, let me go find an interpreter and let me tell you what I need you to do."
Right.
So I said, "You guys go up there and pull security. Don't let them come around us." And I went back to start looking for Charlesworth, and he's back immediately on the radio calling for close air support to come up and help us if we could get any. We didn't really have any success there because where we were, and again, there was not a lot of resources around those days. And then I heard thump, boom, thump, boom, thump, boom. So I look back and I go back to Digby, my next friend. John Digby was in the truck behind that one, in his little Toyota Corolla, and he had a 203 grenade launcher. And the first thing that Digby had done, he was a sniper from Vermont and a highway patrolman up there, a real solid guy, fiery little fella, good in a firefight, and I'm convinced that he probably saved our life that night. Because the first thing that Digby did is jump out of that truck and start dumping 203 rounds down the riverbed, just dumping grenade launcher right at him down the riverbed to kind of turn the tide of that ambush. So I ran back there to Digby and I said, "Are you good?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm good." And about the time I did that, at this point I'm standing up in the road, and there's still a little fire going both ways, and or what seemed like a little now is probably a lot then. But the infantry company behind us on the road, back up the road a little ways from us, had heard that we got in a firefight, knew that we had the Afghans with us. They could hear the fire going off, and they called back to their base, where we were camping, basically back behind us, and said, fire some illumination rounds, some mortar rounds up over the front of where that convoy is, so they can see, so the Afghans can see to shoot. So I'm standing there in the road, and I hear boom, and the parachute flare with the illumination round goes off over me. I had been standing in pitch black shooting a weapon, and now I'm standing in the middle of the road with this flare off right over my head. I literally kind of glanced down, and it's like I didn't have a shadow. You couldn't have put it right over my head any better. And I'm just looking at the ditch there, at the tree line where they're shooting at us, and I look over at Digby, and I said, "Really?" And he's like, "Holy crap!" Whatever, So I just dropped down into the ground and lay still. With if I remember thinking, I need to keep my plates pointed toward where the fire's coming from, and I just laid there real still until the flare went out, and then I got up, and Digby says, "We've got to go at them," because they were still close enough that it was a close fight. So he dumped the last couple of 2 or 3 rounds that he had, and I grabbed some of my Afghan guys. I thought of a few names there. Izzat Khan was the squad leader. I grabbed a few of those guys. I said, "Izzat Khan, how many guys you got here?" And he told me 5, 6, whatever. I said, "Get them on line. We're going right there toward the muzzle flash." So we took off down into the creek bed. And we got down there about to where Digby had been dumping 2 or 3 rounds. And we found several blood trails and some weapons and stuff. And there's a village right on the back side of the creek. So we just pushed right into the first compound on the other side of the village. And Digby, being the high-speed guy that he had, wanted to throw a flashbang, explode and blind you kind of thing into the compound before we go in. So he's like, "Hold on." He has this flashbang he'd been carrying around for months, and pulls it out, pulls a pin, throws it in there. Nothing. So we finally just go. So we go in, and he looks around and turns on his flashlight. Like, "Oh, there it is." Still had the tape wrapped around the spoon so it wouldn't go off. We had to cut the tape. So we get back out to the far side of the village, and at that point, knowing how jumpy the Afghans are in the dark and can't see, and we didn't want to link back up, I just said, "Okay, we're going to sit down right here." And we tried to follow their trail out of the village up this mountain, and I could see footprints way far apart there. You could tell they were booking it, getting out of the backside of the village, and knew that we wouldn't do any good chasing them up the side of the mountain with me, Digby, and 5 or 6 Afghans. So we stopped, sat down, and waited till daylight to go back in and link back up with our guys. We didn't have any kind of fratricide. But real exciting stuff, but a whole lot of comedy involved in it, as long as nobody's getting shot in a firefight. Winston Churchill said, "There's nothing in the war or when the world's so exhilarating as getting shot at without result." And that was one of those nights that you go back in the next day and go, "Wow, it was intense." And we had started getting reports on the radio the next day that because our Afghans had these little ICOM radios, and they could talk to the Taliban. They give each other crap on the radio. We're going to find you, son of a pig, whatever. They'd talk to each other on their little shortwave radios. And we'd listen to their stuff a lot too, and have our Afghans tell us what they were saying, etc. And so we got some reports the next day that we had killed a few of them, and that there were a couple wounded, and that they were basically putting the guy in a car to try to smuggle him back to Pakistan, where they'd always take him for medical treatment. And that was one of the first big conflicts we got, or shootouts we got in, where we knew we'd killed somebody. And Charlesworth asked me, he said, Digby and I, when we got that, kind of cold-hearted, we high-fived about it. Said, "Yeah, we got some." And Charlesworth, our team chief, said, "You guys shouldn't celebrate that. We killed somebody last night." And I said, "Well, it's hard for me to feel bad about it because they were trying to kill us. I'm not out there to take anybody's life, but I'm certainly going to defend my own or those of my men." So yeah, there's the good and bad part of getting out there in combat. And then the loss of life is something completely different for us that I can go into later in some of the other deployments. But that trip there to CAC Afghan, I tell people, when you want to define the failure of recognizing an end state in Afghanistan and why we're still there after 14 years, 12 years now, whatever it is, we were there for the free election. We had less than 30,000 people on the ground. The Afghan army was a corps, was 3 full brigades, a big enough force to defend their borders from most aggressors without our help. And if it got to be something much more aggressive that we could defend them, they could defend themselves with our help, with force enablers, with combat support, with aviation, with medical support, with a little money. So they had a perfectly capable small army.
No, you say 3 or 4 brigades. Is that about 1,200 to 3,000?
No, that'd be about 9,000 to 10,000 at that time.
Oh,
So they
okay.
had about a 10,000 man army, which is small, but there's never been a time in history where anyone has controlled all of Afghanistan. What you really have to control in Afghanistan to be successful is the major population centers and the highways.
Mm-hmm.
So you control their commerce, you control the major population centers, and then you basically put up a wall and say to the villagers out there, to Nuristan, for example, we're going to have commerce, trade, a government, healthcare, fresh water, all those things down here in our government. If you want to participate, that's up to you. Come on down and participate. We would like you to. We're not going to be hostile to you. We're not going to allow you to come in and be hostile to us either. And you make them want to be a part of that government rather than go out and say, hey, you're going to be part of the new army because you live, or the new government because you live in this area.
Right.
You need to make it more of an invitation rather than coercion, which what is a hard coin to flip.
Right.
But we were there in late August, early September. We held free elections. We provided site security there for the polling site in Afghan. We saw the Afghans come in and vote, and they were all tickled to death to do it. Held the ink on the thumb and said, I voted. Karzai was elected as the president of Afghanistan. And in my mind, I saw that right there and said, okay, boys, it's time to leave. We just achieved a reasonable end state.
Mm-hmm.
You've had free elections. You have a fledgling democracy. You have a young, dedicated, somewhat experienced army that can defend the key points of this country with our assistance. We can continue to enable and to grow their army, but it's time for us as a force to step out. But we didn't recognize success when we got to it. So we're still there today trying to figure out, essentially, like I say, we're terrible tourists as an army. No country likes a foreign army in their country, and the longer we stay, the more enemies we create,
Right.
and the more bogged down we become.
Absolutely.
So I went from Mazar-e-Sharif down to back to Kabul, went out to Herat. We responded to some fighting out there, between some factional fighting. And then I went from Herat to Kandahar. The story to go from Kabul to Herat was kind of funny, in that we had about 30 minutes notice that, hey, your battalion is going to the other side of the country today. Grab everything you can. So I grabbed my backpack, my rucksack, and all the equipment I thought I'd need. Was loading ammo on the C-130 when they flew us from Kabul to Herat, and then we got in as a force to be a peacekeeping force between two fighting factions there. They were bringing bodies into the compound there when we arrived in Herat. Ishmael Khan was the warlord out there, and then I didn't go back to Kabul again for another 4 months or so. We just stayed, lived out of mud huts and a tent once in a while, and I went from Herat out in the western part of the country down to Kandahar. There was a relief in place at that time in the May time frame. They were going to change the brigade in Kandahar out, and the 10th Mountain was leaving, and the 25th ID was coming in, and the 25th ID wanted to see some of the capabilities of the Afghan army and start moving them further out into the nether regions there. The fight where in the south was predominantly Taliban controlled at that time, or Taliban supporting because of the Pashtun ties there. So I ended up down on the border with the French task force. It was the first counterterrorism task force, the French task force Ares there at Spin Bulldog, which is right on the Afghan-Pakistan border, way down south, about as far south as any of the highways would go. And conducted combat ops with the French guys for a couple months. Then we and I ran into the operations officer and the brigade commander for the incoming task force there at Kandahar, that's That's about the highest level boss guy in the country at that time. And I had seen this trend in the beginning with when we got there, and as we started to kind of develop our operation with the Afghans. So at this time, I'm about 8 months into deployment. I saw this trend with the American forces to want to break up the Afghan units and say, hey, I need 5 Afghans to come with me to do this. I need a dozen Afghan soldiers to come with us to provide security so the locals see an Afghan face. And I kept telling our leadership, and I even preached to the brigade commander when I bumped into him down there, because they came to see what we were doing and see the Afghan soldiers down there on the border and at Spin Bulldog. And he says, well, what do? Who are you guys? Because they immediately thought we were a bunch of SF guys or something, because this is not a National Guard mission. And I told him we were the embedded trainers for the Afghan Army. Well, what do you do, and how do you support it, and where do you get your logistical support? And I showed him. I said, I got a bag full of cash. I carried $100,000 worth of cash around with me to pay for their food and to buy more of whatever we needed. I said, the challenge that we have here is that all the American forces, SF included, want to break up the Afghan forces into small tag-along parts and take them with them out on operations. I kept telling them, they're capable, we've just got to let them exercise their own command and control, so that we're not here in 10 years still leading them around to learn how to do what their operations the way we want them to. Mm-hmm. Except an Afghan version of good. It's Afghan good enough. It doesn't have to look like an American Army operation every time. And here we are 10 years later, we've always struggled with wanting things to look the way we are comfortable with seeing them. We can't step back and say, okay, Afghans, you've got it. And what you'll see at the end of this war is just like we did in Iraq, is we'll just step back at one day and say, okay, we're done, you got it. And we never developed those guys to say, incrementally say, we're going to let you exercise the command and control in your companies, in your battalions, in your brigades, and we're going to step back out of the way and let you manage this. So
it seems that your first deployment gave you a lot of insight into the culture.
Yeah, it did. I lived with those guys all the time. I was isolated out there with them. Like I said, there were lots of days. When I went down with the French there for 2-3 months, there was me and one other American, John Hill. Sergeant Hill and I were the only 2 guys that were out there. And Hill's another Vermont PD guy, or Vermont Highway Patrol guy, and he was also a sniper trained guy from up at Vermont, and solid soldier. And he and I were the only 2 guys down there for 200-300 miles any direction that were Americans. So when we went on operations or whatever we did, it was me and Hill and however many Afghans. And sometimes when our operations dictated that I split my company in 2 directions, or their Afghan company in 2 directions, Hill went with one, I went with the other, and we only had one interpreter. So I always gave Hill the interpreter because he didn't speak any Dari like I did. So I'd be out sometimes for days at times with just me and a bunch of Afghans, no interpreter, no nothing. So I had to learn it and had to learn how to get along with them.
So did you develop a camaraderie with the Afghan forces themselves?
Absolutely. I tell a story a lot about going into search compounds, and I would have Sammy, we call him Samir, was one of my NCOs, good guy, used to tell me about being up at Kunduz when the initial ground war started, and they had the Taliban, or well, he said the Taliban leadership. He said Bin Laden was there, trapped up at the Kunduz airport. He said the B-52 flies over the Kunduz airport and drops bombs and does a circle, and I'm sure it wasn't the same plane. He says it circles back around, and they see something come out of the back of the plane on their side, and they think, oh no, the Americans are bombing us, the Northern Alliance guys. And he says, and then it hits the ground, it's coats and MREs, and they're giving food, water, and ammo. And he said, hey, it was a very good NCO, Sammy was, Samir was. But I would start to go into a compound, and there I am, and got plate, chest carrier. So there I am with, protective gear on, good weapon, going into the door of a compound, and the Afghan soldiers would try to step in front of me going through the door. And I'd say, hey, I got it, I'm okay. Oh no, Riley, we will protect you. You came here to fight for our country. We will make sure that you're safe. And I had another one of my squad leaders that we were out on patrol a couple times, and I would, as a experienced advisor, company commander, some time in the Army, I'd walk up and down the formation as we're patrolling, watching the soldiers, telling them, hey, spread out, watch this way, just kind of giving them pointers on what they need to be doing to be more effective along the route, and generally just kind of keeping myself in a position to watch things. And one of my Afghan NCOs would always come when I'd get around the edge of the formation somewhere. He'd come and grab me and say, Riley, you come back to the middle. He says, they will steal you. He was always afraid that the Taliban would kidnap me and take me off somewhere, which was very real threat at the time, but not something I ever worried about. But they were a good bunch of solid guys.
So during your first deployment, you had just been married right before you deployed. How did your deployment affect that marriage?
Well, I was gone for 2 straight years. We'd been dating before the deployment, and then I came back from the deployment, and when I redeployed from that first trip to Afghanistan, I probably had a pretty good dose of PTSD coming back, and it wasn't that it was all so traumatic. You experience things that you never thought you'd see, and your life's threatened, and we had one guy that I was with up in Mazar-i Sharif that got killed later in that deployment. I wasn't around when he died, but you lose friends, and you see people wounded and that kind of thing, and it's just more than anything, I think the extended sense of not being in a place where you can sleep well and know that you're going to go to bed at night and not have to wake up worried about your safety is something that kind of wears on your psyche. And you develop habits over there. I'm in the habit to this day of watching people's hands, because if I can see your hands, I know what you're doing with them. Hands kill, we say. Somebody's reaching into their shirt or reaching behind them. You watch people's hands, you know what their intentions are. So I came home pretty wound up. I remember I got home, and my new wife at the time, we'd been married about a year, and we hadn't announced it to our families or anything. I came home, went back to Durant, said, hey, I'm going to go run down to Walmart. I was all excited. Beautiful day. I told my mother when I get back to the United States, it's like to be in a coloring book. Everything's so green, because everything's just, various shades of brown in Afghanistan by and large. Beautiful September day. I called my wife then up and said, hey, I'm going to go down to Walmart, get some steaks, and grill steaks out tonight. So I pull into Walmart there in Durant, jump out the truck, head into the front door of Walmart, and I get about 10 or 15 steps into the front door, and I just stop, and I can just feel anxiety, and I'm trying to, there's motion everywhere, the lights are on, the red, white, blue, green, colors everywhere, people moving all over the place, and I just kind of swallow and turn around, walk back out the door, got in the truck, called her back up and said, I can't do that. She's like, what do you mean? I said, there's too much motion, too many lights, too many people, can't go in there. And I didn't really get it. I was like, oh, I don't know what that is. And I told her, I said, I'm trying to watch everything, I can't. And then you get in the habit too. For a long time, when I got back from that first one, going down the road, I'd look at trash bags as I'd go by. Like if you see trash on the side of the highway, I'd watch it all the way past. Is it gonna blow up or not? And you'll still hear young guys from Afghanistan and Iraq that say they look at trash on the road all the time. Because that psychological threat of just waiting for an explosion next to your vehicle all the time is something that just is hard to get past, especially in the beginning. Like I said, after you've done 2 or 3 deployments, you kind of get used to it. You know what's really bad, what's not so bad. You know how to protect yourself, and you kind of get desensitized to some of it. My last deployment, they were shooting and stuff go off, and most people would be hitting the ground, and I wouldn't move. I'd just look, see what was over, and so that's over there somewhere. Because I kind of developed a sense to understand the difference between getting shot at and getting shot at. You feel the difference. If you hear an explosion, it typically means it didn't get you. It's the ones you don't hear are the ones that are going to get you.
Right. So, between your time on hostile soil in Afghanistan and back home, what was the time frame?
Yeah, there's where the National Guard has done, especially in the beginning of the war, did a really good or a really poor job, or the Army. Part of it is the fault of the soldier too. You know, we didn't have a support network for National Guardsmen. We came home from Afghanistan. I was on the last chalk, the last group of Americans of 45th soldiers coming out of Afghanistan. I was on the last bird out. Everybody else was already gone. Commander was gone. All the staff was gone. All the other task force guys were gone. Had one plane load of us left. And we got back, flew back to Fort Carson, and I was there for about 6 or 7 days. And they said, okay, go over here, take a hearing test, fill out a questionnaire, blood pressure, whatever. Did you get wounded? What were you exposed to, etc. And okay, you can go home now. Good luck. We came back to Oklahoma, and I went back to Durant. So in the time frame of the travel and demo of about 2 weeks, I'm back at the house. So you go from, and literally my last mission, I think we somewhat jokingly and somewhat seriously, when you get short there at the end, we knew the day that we were going back to Kabul, going to go through our equipment turn in and get on a plane and leave. The last big mission we had, there were a few of us that were did it kind of as a joke, but we were drawing straws to see who were going to go on which part of the mission, because we had just had a couple of kids from the 25th Infantry Division get blown up in an IED and burned real bad, and one of our interpreters killed, and the IED threat was getting bigger and bigger there. And then just a month or so ahead of that, we'd had I think 4 Special Forces guys got hit by an IED there in Zabul Province where we were. So it was intense, and there was that that enduring sense of not being safe every day still persisted. So then you come home, send you back to the house within 2 weeks and say good luck to you, and you're done, you're out, you're back in the civilian world.
Were there any systems set up to help veterans cope with PTSD at that time?
Well, they had call military one source. Here's the 1-800 number you can call. Of course, we were all somewhat in denial about it. You think, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm fine. We got a few firefights, no big deal. You don't really understand the change that makes in you until later. I even a couple months ago said to one of my buddies something about not that I've got PTSD or anything, but I said I still do have dreams, whatever. He laughed at me. He said, "Yeah, like you don't have PTSD." But at that time I never thought, "Oh, that's no big deal." It's it's just I thought my experiences are nothing compared to what my granddad went through in World War II, or what every Vietnam veteran might have gone through in Vietnam. What I did in Afghanistan was low intensity conflict, spread out over a big country with a few firefights, explosions, and this and that. It's nothing. It's no big deal. There's nothing wrong with me. But yeah, I came home and I was wound up. I was nervous in crowds. I was watching trash on the highway. I started drinking too much, to the point that it became somewhat detrimental in my marriage. That I was like, wow. And I basically quit drinking for a couple months. Didn't go to any counseling or anything, but I was, I kind of realized later on, I was jacked up there for a while. I just kind of worked through it. But I also had the advantage of being, a 30-year-old captain when I went. The guys that I had the greater amount of respect and kind of a sense that they needed more were those young, 19, 23-year-old E1, E2, E3, E4 kids that this is, they're brand new in the Army, and we're going to put them over there in this situation, a real hostile situation, and they don't have the coping skills to figure it out in their own head that I did as a 30-something-year-old captain with a master's degree.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so those are the guys that needed something more than what we had to offer. But the Army hadn't figured out how to support the National Guard at that time.
Whenever you came back from your first deployment and you experienced these PTSD symptoms, how did that relate socially to you? Did it affect your family, such as your parents, your siblings, your wife?
I'm sure my wife was affected. Just living with me was probably not real good for a while. I was real reactionary. I was real hot tempered. and I'm a pretty easygoing guy by nature, but I was pretty hot-tempered. I was drinking a bunch, but I was never a real social person. I was always staying at home, staying out of sight. Liked to be at home with the door shut. So it didn't really affect that part of my social life. Of course, I hadn't had one because I'd been gone for 2 years, So I had to kind of figure out how to reintegrate society and figure out what I was going to do for a job next. But yeah, I know it caused some stress in the family.
Did you talk about your experiences with civilians?
No. It's it's hard for people to understand what you did, or it's hard to relate something that is that far out of your daily norm to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So, even my son, I remember him when I was a kid, and I was real jumpy with noises and things after that first deployment to Afghanistan. We were going to a birthday party, and he was about 6 or 7 at the time. And I remember him saying to one of his little friends, "Don't pop any balloons around Shane," which I felt terrible about that. That
Mm-hmm.
he basically has to treat me with kid gloves because I'm jumpy. But yeah, there definitely impacts on family there. But we, like I said, I've had the resilience of being a grown man at 30-something years old and being educated to work my way through that stuff. And a lot of young guys don't. And those are the ones that I always think of in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
So I came back and immediately started looking for a job, and I got offered a job at the Choctaw Nation down in Durant. At the same time, I heard that the National Guard was flying a position for a training officer back down in Durant at the unit that I was from. So I would have come on orders then as an active duty captain, and already had about 3 years of active duty at that time. I thought, man, that'd be a good career path, opportunity for me to check out. So I did. Applied for the job and got hired on to work full time for the Guard, and had my battalion that I had come from had deployed to Egypt back in '03,
Mm-hmm.
and then come back that summer. And some of the officers, we had then gone directly from Egypt to Afghanistan and had come home. The large majority of the battalion hadn't deployed to Afghanistan with us on Task Force Phoenix 2 mission, and we're back at home and stabilizing. So at this point, the Army is just taxed severely on manpower, and they're starting to use the National Guard more. They're starting to see there was this reluctance back to the active duty force to put National Guard units in combat roles because of their seeing us as the old guard, and they're a strategic reserve, and they're not trained to do this. And they're a bunch of old weekend warriors, and we don't want to put those guys out there on the line because they can't handle it.
Mm-hmm.
We were starting to slowly see that mindset change, somewhat by necessity and some by exposure, for the active force to look at the National Guardsman and say, "Wow, this guy's a 32-year-old captain with a master's degree who also can hump up and down mountains all day and shoot if he needs to."
Right.
Or this guy is a 11 Bravo infantryman who is also a carpenter by trade, or this guy is an operations officer who is also a bank president back in Oklahoma. And they started to see that we were mature, capable soldiers that just didn't practice Army every day like they do. But when you put us into that role, because we're a more mature force, we've got life experiences that a lot of 19-year-old kids don't. No offense to them, they just haven't done it yet.
Right.
That we can be good in those roles, for whether it be an infantry role or something complex. It's not that infantry's not, but whatever complex operation you need to get done there, the Guard can do it.
Mm-hmm.
So they started to deploy us into more complex roles as the war went on. So when I got back from Afghanistan, got hired on full time for the National Guard in Oklahoma, the battalion that I had come from Egypt had got an alert order to go back to Afghanistan again the following year, attached to the Oregon National Guard as part of Task Force Phoenix 5 now. So it's the same progression of National Guard units going to do the Afghan training mission.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're up to Task Force Phoenix 5. Oregon's got the command group that General Mancino would have been at one time. So now Brigadier General Pritt from Oregon and the 180th under Bob Yandel, the colonel that was in charge of the commander of the 1A at the time, is now going to go back to Afghanistan as a security force for Task Force Phoenix there in Kabul, and then those embedded training teams. By this time, the army of the Afghan army had begun to grow in size, and they started to move the core, the central core we called it, from Kabul, had now begun to move out into the regional areas, so where they were going to stand up a regional core, an RCAG, out in Gardez, one down at Kandahar, one up in Mazar-i Sharif, I think one over in Herat. So now the Army's going into those regions where before we had only ventured out with a battalion and do an operation and go back to Kabul again, or go back to Kandahar again, back to a base where we had life support. So you see now in 2005, 2006, now the Afghan Army's starting to grow and expand across the country into a sustained role, which means you need more trucks, more trainers, more logistics support, more security forces. Our footprint's getting bigger and bigger at this time.
Right.
So now, rather than send that National Guard battalion to a peacekeeping mission, the Army being overwhelmed in Iraq and seeing an expansion in Afghanistan, grabs this infantry brigade from Oregon and the 2nd Corps Battalion from Oklahoma and says, we need you to come to Afghanistan. And those 2nd Corps companies that Oklahoma provided started to go out into the areas where before it only been an embedded trainer or two in a special forces team. Now we've got company size elements out there on the battlefield in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And that's one of those was over where the movie Restrepo was filmed, over in Korengal Valley, and that's where the 180th out of southeastern Oklahoma took its first casualty of the war, and Sergeant Buddy Huey got killed over in Afghanistan, or in Korengal in February of '07. Because I had been on 2 deployments, I stayed back as the rear detachment, kind of the officer in charge in the back on the full-time side for the 180th. So I'm conducting daily the support operations for the country, for the guys back here, keeping the offices open, answering the phone, dealing with casualty assistance stuff back here. So when Sergeant Huey got killed, I got the call from Colonel Yandel in country and said, hey, we've had a soldier killed. You're going to have to go notify the family, do all that, walk the family through the process, this burial arrangements, handle the life insurance issues, all those things that go with being a casualty assistance officer. So that was my kind of the thing that sunk in what effect it has on the family back here, not being the warrior out deployed and living on adrenaline and little sleep and bad food, but being back here and seeing families on a daily basis without their soldier around, and then getting a call one day to say, hey, we've lost one and you need to go tell his family. You gotta go knock on the door and say it's with deep regret to inform you that your son was killed on behalf of Grateful Nation, et cetera, and explain the situation, then walk the family through the funeral. It was a great honor of mine for me to do that, and I tried to make sure that we did it with the most respect possible. But after that deployment that I'd have to get to Afghanistan, and the kind of the reintegration that I'd had to try to get my head wrapped around getting settled back down and living in society, that flared all that stuff back up again, and I was wound up when I was putting Buddy Huey to rest. But we did the best we could for his family, and from what I remember of him and from everything that everybody else had ever said, great kid, gave his life essentially trying to save some Afghan soldiers in an ambush in the Korengal Valley area. They got isolated and pinned down, and some of them were getting shot up, and he ran up into the front of the convoy to try to get them together, get them backed up away from where they were, and even was doing first aid on a couple of wounded when he got killed. So that was a time when it really brought home what we ask our soldiers to do, what we ask the families back here to do as well. Tough time that kind of took some of the bravado out of my leadership. I used to be a little more cocky and a little more of a loudmouth than I am these days, I think, and that kind of took some of the wind out of my sails and humbled me a little bit in that regard.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So while the 180th was over in Afghanistan, not long after we lost Buddy Huey, the infantry brigade, who had the leadership had gone to Afghanistan, are back. Now this one battalion's gone to Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq still wages on. The requirements of Afghanistan still continue to grow, and now the Abu Ghraib thing happens. There is a huge oversight now in Iraq over prisoner treatment and how detainees are handled. Mm-hmm. And because we've been in Iraq so long and detaining and arresting so many local nationals, the sheer number of individuals in prisons or in detainee camps over there is growing and growing and growing, and there aren't enough MPs in the Army on a rotational basis to handle it all. Mm-hmm. So again, the big Army looks at the National Guard and says, well, we need some security forces and some people to provide detainee operations support, run little prison camps basically for Iraq. Right. So they look at the 45th, and other than that one battalion that's on this off rotation from the rest of the brigade, they look at the 45th here in Oklahoma and say, you guys have the command and control capability that you demonstrated in Afghanistan in 03, 04. You've got the manpower to go do this mission. They alerted the 45th now to go to Iraq to provide detainee operations support at Camp Bucca, Camp Cropper, in Baghdad, Camp Bucca down the southern part of the country, and around Nasra. And then our brigade headquarters was going to go and provide a command and control element, or a joint area support group, they called it, in Baghdad, in the basically the strategic operations center where General Petraeus' headquarters was. So we mobilized the brigade. Me being on the rear detachment, I essentially gathered up everybody that we had come in as a new recruit, or everybody that didn't deploy to Afghanistan, and made a detainee operations or Sec 4 company, security force company, out of all the rear detachment that didn't go to Afghanistan, that was back in the headquartered out of Durant, the 180th there. And then we attached ourselves to the 45th here, the headquarters out of Oklahoma City, and went to Fort Bliss, Texas, to go to do detainee ops in Iraq. So my guys, the battalion that I belonged to, were coming home from Afghanistan. As I'm going out from Iraq, we kind of passed on the tarmac. We passed on the flight line and say, mm-hmm. Okay, welcome home, see you later, my turn to go. So the soldiers from the 180th Alpha Company, 180 primarily out of McAllister, that's where we put the headquarters flag. They went to Camp Bucca and Camp Cropper and did security force operations for detainees. And then I was attached to the brigade headquarters here and ended up in the green zone, running the entry control points in the green zone, running the fire and rescue, ambulance services, EOD, explosive ordnance disposal support, and those kind of things for the green zone. Yeah. So basically, our headquarters owned the green zone, and what went on in there and went in and out on a daily basis. What seemed like it would be a pretty mundane, kind of easy, we're in the middle of Baghdad, but we're in the most heavily fortified, secure area in the country. Thought it would be a pretty easy deal. And my experience of hanging around in an operations center for all those years started to pay off there as I kind of restructured the way our operations center worked and started to try to better integrate our headquarters into the strategic operations center downstairs with us, and the other entities that lived in the green zone with us. There was a combat support hospital, 86 Cash was just down the street, NATO, United Nations Assistance Mission to Iraq, all the different embassies that were there. The British had an embassy, the Polish had an embassy, the American embassy. We were on the embassy compound where I worked there. We tried to integrate with all those organizations because at the end of the day we were the command and control for that area. Mm-hmm. So like I said, I thought that was going to be a pretty easy deployment. And Easter Sunday, we got there in January, and on Easter Sunday we had about 16 or 17 107 millimeter rockets launched at the green zone from across the northeast side of the Tigris River, Sadr City, which Muqtada al-Sadr was a Sunni cleric, very much backed by Iran, and the Mahdi army, they called them there, were pretty adamantly fighting against the Sunni-led government, and then against the coalition government that was being established there at the time. And their most effective way to disrupt our operations with those 107 rockets, and they had some 177 and 204, I think, for the 204 millimeter rocket, and those things sound like a freight train coming at you through the air. But those rockets started launching at us on a daily basis, and they, for about the next 3 straight months, they rocketed us every day. And it kind of made me think back to the stories I heard about Bastogne, and it's nothing in comparison. I know. I think we lost we had 17 people killed in that 3-month period in Baghdad, in the green zone while I was there. Some right there on the compound that we were in, some just scattered around different areas of the green zone. We had one rocket that hit a gymnasium. There were some guys working out in the gym there in the middle of the afternoon. It hit the gym, killed several American service members. But it reminded me back to Bastogne and some of the stories you hear about how demoralizing those continuous artillery barrage or rocket attack is. And it was the same way for me there in Iraq. Even though I had been exposed to some pretty significant danger in Afghanistan, it's that feeling of how random those rockets are and where are they going to hit. I mean, we had concrete barriers, T-walls, we called them, up everywhere, and we had little bunkers to get in, and we had a counter rocket and mortar radar that would essentially tell you where a round was going to hit, and the alarm would go off, so you'd know if you're around where that alarm's going off, get flat on the ground or get in a bunker before it hits. But some of them would go under, or whatever, the radar. So you'd have these random explosions all the time, 24 hours a day, and that again, that sense of just random danger is something that just kind of wears on you over time, especially for 3 months. You just get, that bang, bang for 3 months in a row, and there's shrapnel, holes in trailer walls where people are sleeping and things like that, and casualties, etc. It kind of wears on you. And there, at that point, we mobilized in late 2007. We got there in January of 2008. So we were right then in the middle of the surge. The surge was happening in Iraq. So I had gone in 03, 04 from this backwater war where I had bought half of my own equipment to get there, and lived on local food, and was off by myself all the time with a bunch of Afghans soldiers, fighting a fight that I really had a lot of control on what I did myself on a daily basis, to go right into the middle of Iraq in the middle of the surge. And I'm at the headquarters building where Petraeus' office is, and I'm seeing from that low resource and low conflict area right into the middle of a high intensity conflict in the full attention and military might of the United States Army. And it was a huge transition to see, to go from what no resources looked like in a low intensity but high stress conflict, to go to that where you're in the center of stage all the time, and guys like John McCain and Barack Obama and every senator that you could think of at the time was coming through. You passed General Petraeus in the hall every day, that kind of thing, and so you're right in the middle of the happenings of that entire theater of war. So it was really, from a historic standpoint, it was cool for me to see that, and I got to see the other side of what that conflict could look like in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean,
I've heard stories where soldiers, Marines, and in similar situations, the bombardment is what I'm referring to, and they develop a mindset along the notion of it, well, if it's my time to go, it's my time to go, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Or on the other hand, very superstitious. Every little move will set you off. And how did that affect you personally? How did you react to a situation like that?
I kind of developed partly a sense to tell when I heard a rocket coming. I could tell if it was going to hit close or not. You know, I could tell, and I even with mortars now I'm that way. If I hear a rocket or a mortar coming through the air at me, I can tell if I need to get on the ground or not, if it's going to get close. Because if it's got a different buzz coming, it's got a different whiz sound to it when it comes right at you. And it sounds like it's coming faster, it's more direct. The ones that are going overhead, I can listen to them and say, yeah, that's going to sail right past us. And so, you know, it was intense in the beginning. The first one that hit, because I was in the operations center, and I get up and, you know, go from my trailer up to work, get on the computer, start, you know, typing up the report on what just happened. You know, the first one hit. On that time I was on shift from like 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And at about 5:30 in the morning, I had a rocket hit right by my trailer, like 100 meters outside my trailer. So that one got my attention. You know, I was like, and I got to the point that if I was out, because I worked 12-hour shift every day up there in the operations center in the TOC, I would wake up falling at night. We would get rockets coming in, and you would hear them, or you'd hear the alarm, the counter rocket and mortar alarm go off for the radar, saying and say incoming, incoming, incoming on this loudspeaker. And I would hear that, and before I was even awake enough to realize what I was doing, I would roll off into the floor on the trailer to get as low as you can to the ground, because those rockets will hit and the shrapnel will go up and out. So I kind of, you know, you kind of develop a sense to know how to react to those things.
It seems like you're describing like a muscle memory.
Yeah, you just kind of get used to it after a while.
Wow.
I'm probably one of the more if it's your time kind of guys. You know, I didn't get real wound up about it all. I figure out one of those 107s hits, and it has a burst radius of about 50 meters, maybe less. Where, you know, if you're within 50 meters of it, it's probably going to hit you. If you're within 25 meters of it, it's going to hit you. You know, if you're within less than 25 meters of it, it's going to kill you. But if you're more than 50 meters away, you've got a good chance of survival, especially if you get flat on the ground.
Right.
So when I hear the alarm go off, I'd get flat on the ground and let them explode, and then go on back about my business.
And you said that there were 17 casualties during that.
Yeah, I think
17
17's right. We had right, and of course, being in the operations center, I had some, you know, was able to track that stuff pretty well, and was handling the casualty evacuations and things. So, you know, between the third country nationals, the local workers that were there, cooking, doing laundry, all those things, security, and the American civilians and military members that were killed. I think there were about 17 that were killed in that 3 month period. We had about 218 rockets hit the green zone right there around us at that time.
Wow.
So it was pretty constant. You know, we'd get 2 or 3 barrages a day of 10 or 12 rockets, and they just, when they'd hit it, boom, 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 you'd go, maybe sometimes you go an hour or two before you get a single, or you go another 12 hours and get 15 more.
You related almost a sense of apathy toward enemy casualties. How did that change with American casualties? How do you grieve?
Oh yeah. It's rough. And there's the part where me as an officer and a leader there at the time, in the operations center and in direct and daily operations, and I dealt with that more on my last deployment to Afghanistan. You know, you always question, did I do enough? What else could I do to prevent this? To make this a safer environment for service members, especially when, like, you know, later in my fourth deployment, my last deployment to Afghanistan, I was planning our operations on a daily basis. So I'm drawing up the scheme of maneuver for how we're going to go out and do these operations, and then when a soldier gets killed out there, I'd sit down and stare at the wall and, you know, have that hard question of yourself. Did I plan this in a way that was effective? Did I do everything that I could not to get that guy killed? You know, at the end of the day, I understand there's a certain level of control that I don't have.
Right.
But it's hard not to question yourself there. So in those instances where it was one of our own casualties, two things. One, I always question is, was there anything I could have done personally to keep this from happening? And two, with an artillery barrage like that or a rocket barrage like that, and we're in there in the green zone, but we don't own the areas where it's coming from. The point of origin of that rocket is out there in somebody else's area, somebody else's battle space. In that specific instance with us in Baghdad there, it was out in bad guy land. So you had kind of this sense of helplessness that I can't go over there, frustration. I want to go over there and do something about that. But me personally, my job's right here in this seat,
Right. Controlling
the fight right here in front of this bank of computer screens and wall of information and technology. I've got to stay in my lane and run my fight, and somebody else above me and lateral to me on the battlefield has to deal with that if it's going to get dealt with.
Was there an outlet for that frustration at all?
Go to the gym, yeah. Yeah, go to the gym. And they did end up going out. General Petraeus said we've got to do something about these rockets. It was on Fox News, and sometimes I had Fox News on one of them. I had 6 TV screens up on the wall in front of me at my operations center, and one of them was on Fox News a lot of times, watching, or CNN, whatever, watching reports about Baghdad or about Iraq. Just kind of know what we're dealing with. Kind of keep updated on current events, so we know what the latest damage control or information we need to be aware of is. And sometimes there'd be a rocket hit, and I'd hear it explode outside, and it'd be on the news faster than I could figure out where on the ground it happened around me. And I'd see, oh, okay, I know where that is. It's right back here, and we'd send somebody to respond to the scene, get EOD or casualty evacuation, that kind of thing on the scene. And because that was such a high-profile thing, and there were people that worked for the contracting companies that were going home from Baghdad at that time, they said, I've been here for 4 years. This is the worst I've ever seen it. These barrages are not stopping. I'm leaving. I tell everybody I know what fear smells like, because it smells like people that haven't bathed. Because in the building that we worked in, there were no showers, and it had a hard top on it. There's a hardened structure, but the trailers that we slept in were not hardened. So people wouldn't go out and sleep in their trailer because they were afraid they'd get killed. I refused. Kind of like I thought back to 9/11 and said, we're not going to let the terrorists tell us how to live. We're not going to be defeated by this. And I said, no, I'm going to go out there and sleep in my trailer like I always do. They're not going to change my life. And I said a lot of prayers before I went to bed. Said, hope I wake up in the morning. Hope I don't have a rocket hit right on my trailer tonight. But I wasn't going to say, okay, I've been defeated. I'm going to go live in the building and not take a bath all week. And which kind of funny. I went several months without it in Afghanistan, but this became a big deal to me. When you can take a shower, take a shower. It's kind of good.
That was the line of
I said no. They're not. They're not going to scare me out of living my life on a daily basis here. But that became so substantial that General Petraeus directed that MNDB, Multinational Division Baghdad, went out and conducted clearing operations in Sadr City and essentially cleared the city back past Route Pluto, which was the road that ran along the southwest side of Sadr City, and that pushed them out of 107 rocket range of the green zone.
You brought up an interesting point, which I would like to discuss for a minute, and that was the media, the news, both the news as well as film.
Mm-hmm.
How accurately, in your opinion, was Iraq portrayed to the American public?
It's hard to capture on film. It really is. I sat in a theater and cried watching Saving Private Ryan, because I thought that, I haven't heard all my granddad's war stories. I thought that was probably as accurate as you could ever get with that war, captured on film in a moment. And still this day I'll go back and watch that and go, yeah, that's about what it's like getting shot at.
Right.
There's one I've seen that was about an EOD guy. I can't remember the name of that movie, but I've seen a few in the best thing to do is go watch raw footage on the internet.
Right.
And that gives you a pretty good sense of the ground level view of what you see. What you don't get is all the frustrations that guys like me have of the behind the scenes politics, or the wasted millions and billions of dollars that we put into things that I can look at from day one and say, that's not going to work. We're wasting our money. We're wasting our time.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get a lot of some of the comical things that happen, some of the stories that I've gotten on the back of my head that I laugh pretty hard about things that we did that, for one reason or another turned out to be a comedy of errors, or turned out to work perfectly, although it never should have happened in the first place. So, mixed bag there, but that sense is really hard to capture. And of course, I have a skewed sense of perspective now. It's hard for me to know what you get about it and what you don't.
Right.
I can tell it to another, and that's why veterans, service members, guys that serve together have that tight bond, is because when I say we were getting rocketed one day, and I know that guy knows what I'm talking about, he gets it.
Mm-hmm.
But I've seen a few movies and things that get close to capturing the events. The surprising one lately that I saw was the Bin Laden takedown movie.
Mm-hmm.
The end of that, where they show that raid on the compound, I watched that entire thing and said, man, that's awesome. They did a great job of that.
Right.
There's some things they left out, and I know why they did, but the parts that they showed, I was impressed with. I'm like, that's how it is. They get to the door and try to bang one of the doors open, it won't work. Call back and say, hey, come around, we got a door open over here. Things don't always go according to plan. Things aren't always as smooth as you want them to be.
Mm-hmm.
But the dynamics, the look, the feel, the sense of the challenge of how kind of the speed of the combat was all pretty accurate there.
Mm-hmm.
People think that a lot of times that combat's scream, yell, run, it happens real fast. A lot of times things go slow. You gotta have. I talk a lot to my soldiers about tactical patience. Let situation develop. I tell them you can't miss fast enough to win in a gunfight. And that's an old cop and shooter saying, you can't miss fast enough to win. I tell everybody, slow down, take a deep breath, make a good decision based on your experiences, and then go with it.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't happen as fast as you think it does. So there's all that complexity. It's hard to share with the media. It's hard for them to capture.
Absolutely.
But every once in a while you'll catch a bit of something and go, okay, if I could splice together about 15 or 20 movies into a 30-second reel and say, here's kind of what it's really like.
Mm-hmm.
It'd take me some digging, but I could show you pieces that would kind of give you a good perspective.
Right. And there's another point, your assignment during this deployment to Iraq involving detainees. And if my memory serves me correctly, during that time, 05 to 07, there was a lot of media buzz about detainees and mistreatment of prisoners.
Yeah.
Could you comment on that at all?
Well, luckily for me, being over in the green zone, I was not around any of the detainees at all. All of my the soldiers that had come with me from the 180th, the Alpha 180 company, all of my fellow soldiers from the 45th, minus the headquarters element, were all out doing detainee operations. And essentially what they told me in our daily conversations and in discussing it later was, it was a huge challenge for them to remain as transparent as possible and as compliant as possible, and still get their job done. All they were doing is, hey, we're going to feed and water these guys and keep them here in a safe environment. Because the national media, the international media, the press were so hot and heavy on this. If a detainee caught a cold, there might be an investigation. What'd you guys do to this guy and make him sick? And to the point that everything was very controlled, very constrained environment, and they had UN inspectors and international human rights watch people around all the time, making sure they weren't doing the wrong thing.
Right.
And the Abu Ghraib thing turned the tide of that war in a lot of ways, and there's no excuse for what happened there, and that was just a failure for the leadership of those units to be out there and be involved in what soldiers do. and make sure that they're doing the right thing. And that's my last assignment before the one I'm in now. I was the commander of the officer candidate school here for Oklahoma, and I told my future lieutenants there on a daily basis, you should always, whatever you're doing in your operations in this environment, today's environment, everything you do has to be transparent. Whatever you do, you have to be able to, without regret or without fear, say, here's what I did, here's why I did it. Everything you say, everything you do, you ought to be able to imagine it up on the wall in the courtroom someday and say, why'd you do that? Well, here's why I did it. And if you live your life like that, if you manage your operations like that, and if you're out there with your soldiers when they're doing their jobs and making sure that they're doing the same thing, that's something else I'd tell my guys is don't ever do anything that you wouldn't do with your boss standing right next to you.
Right.
And that's, it's hard. It's a hard position to put a 19 or 20-year-old kid in when, especially like, the typical story, I just lost a buddy, and now you're going to put me in a room with a bunch of Iraqi detainees. Yeah, that guy's mad. He's got a chip on his shoulder. It takes constant presence of leadership there to say, hey man, do the right thing.
All right.
And that same thing, that kind of positive peer pressure for your buddy, say, do the right thing, dude. So yeah, it's tough. But our guys went over there. There were a lot of folks that on that deployment, I think, that were frustrated that they were assigned to do detainee operations and not put into a combat operations role. They wanted to be out in the fight. But that's the mission we got from the Army, and that's what we went and did, and they were successful at it. And we didn't have any issues, and nobody running the media with something terrible that an Oklahoma soldier did. That we all came home, did the job, came home with pride. And didn't lose anybody on that deployment either. Didn't have any casualties. While we were there, Red River 66 crash was a helicopter from the aviation unit here out of Lexington, and we did lose 3 soldiers there that were they were with another task force, but Oklahoma guys were there with us. The reason I know that one, Brady Rudolph was the guy I went to high school with. He was a warrant officer that was flying one of the helicopters. So I say we didn't lose anybody. There were 3 Oklahomans that I know of that were killed while we were there.
So can you talk about adjusting from Afghanistan to Iraq? You were talking about how in Afghanistan you did interact with civilians. Was the same true in Iraq?
Yeah. Well, I dealt with a different kind of civilian in Iraq, living on the State Department compound there. I dealt for the first time with a bunch of State Department folks, and being a rural kid from Oklahoma, it was kind of like putting an Army unit in the middle of an Ivy League college. Those were a different kind of people than what I was used to. Right. Smart, intellectual folks, but not really accustomed to war. And in a lot of ways, there was this antagonistic relationship between the State Department and the Army, to the point that the Army, I kind of got this feeling from a lot of the State Department folks that, well, if the Army wasn't here in our way, we could fix all these problems and Iraq would be a peaceful country. Like they just, I even heard one lady, we were in the dining facility there one afternoon or lunch, whatever, and the IEDs along Route Irish, which was the deadliest 2 miles or 5 miles of road in the world there for a few years, the IEDs were so bad that our supplies weren't regular, and nobody was going hungry. I had to restrict my own calories there to keep from getting fat because Army expects me to weigh a certain weight, run a certain speed on my 2 mile run, all that stuff. So I put myself on a little bit of a diet, sitting around in a chair 12 hours a day, fighting the fight on the computer and not being out on the ground. But one day we were out of lettuce in the dining facility, and I heard this civilian lady behind me go, I can't believe all these soldiers in here eating all our food. What are they even doing here? I thought, well, there's a reason we're here. If all the soldiers leave today, you guys are going to have some challenges with the locals, keeping security for yourselves and sleeping peacefully in your bed at night. But so anyway, yeah, I was dealing with a different kind of civilians there, and it was interesting. I'll say that different mindset.
Mhm.
And it's kind of the same thing that I see a lot in American media and American politics. There are a lot of people in the world who don't understand the harsh reality of some cultures and some nations.
Mhm.
We have a high value of human life in America. That's not the same everywhere. The French guys that I was with in Afghanistan had just come from Africa. They had been fighting a counterinsurgency in the Congo somewhere, and they were telling me about seeing babies on bayonets, you know. And there are people here in America and, you know, other peaceful nations that can't even imagine that.
Mhm.
Even me saying it, you can't think of somebody willingly, or an entire group of people willingly doing that, going around and killing babies to stop another race or another ethnic group from populating, you know. And there are some harsh realities out there in the world that people haven't seen. So the old saying about the wolf and the sheepdog protecting the sheep, it's somewhat, as much as people don't like it, there's some necessity for that, you know.
Mhm.
Peaceful people live peaceful lives here, sleep well in their bed at night because somebody's out there on guard.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Before we go on to your next deployment, I realize you have multiple deployments.
Mhm.
Was there anything from that deployment in Iraq that you wanted to talk about that we haven't discussed yet?
Well, you know, just the only thing I saw that was real significant there is in my mind was, again, as a Guard officer, National Guard officer, and I saw that evolution of the National Guard, where we had gone from the peacekeeping missions to the backwater, you know, other fight, not really supported, kind of out of the mainstream media's eye, to being right in the middle of the fight with a command and control element. So we had 3,000 plus American or Oklahoma soldiers there on the ground, and you know, the Army's using us now. They still hadn't put us in a combat role, but they say, okay, we're going to bring you into the big fight. We're going to put you in theater with us. We're going to use you because we need you,
Mhm.
both out of trust now and out of necessity. You know, we started to prove ourselves as an organization to say,
Right.
hey, we can do this job. And we, you know, it's just kind of an evolution there of the Guard growing from that strategic force to an operational force that we could use.
Mhm.
And we came home from that one. Again, my transition after Iraq was much easier than the one from Afghanistan. I kind of knew after Afghanistan, I knew what to expect when I came home from Iraq. I knew to expect that I was going to be jumpy, and that I was going to watch the trash bag on the side of the road, and that I was not going to want to be around crowds. But it was not the same environment that I had had in Afghanistan, which was out there by yourself, alone at night, and, you know, me and a bunch of Afghan soldiers and nobody else. And, you know, in Iraq, even though I was getting bombarded by rockets a lot, I was on a big compound, and again, the biggest base in the country. You know, had good food, had a hot shower, had a place to sleep. Never really worried about somebody coming in the middle of the night, putting a pistol in my head and kidnapping me or something.
Right.
So much less of a strained reintegration there. And that one was, you know, just the being gone for a long time is hard on families. That at that point I had been gone half of my marriage at the time, and I'm sure that didn't help the impending doom of that marriage that was coming on the next deployment.
Right.
But you know, that's the reintegration that's tough on families. Is it's even harder to come and go and come and go and come and go, because now the wife at the time knows what to expect, and when you get the alert order that says, hey, you're going to Iraq in 6 months, it's not just you get on a truck and you leave, or one day she gets to, you be gone for a year, and she gets to dread it for 6 months before you go.
Mhm.
You know, so it's kind of it's a strained process for the whole family. You have to make plans. You know, how life insurance is still good. Are the bills going to get paid, and how? What do I need to do with my truck? Whose birthdays am I going to miss? You know, what elderly relatives might die while I'm gone. all those things happen while you're going overseas. You know, birthdays and Christmas and 4th of July and anniversaries and holidays. All that stuff keeps going. Life just keeps happening.
Well, it seems that the nature of your time in Afghanistan and your time in Iraq brought on different effects, such as small arms fire as compared to major artillery.
Yeah.
Was there a noticeable difference in the way you reacted back home? Such as like 4th of July, for example?
Yeah,
Would that cause...
I do remember I think the 4th of July after Iraq, I didn't like that, yeah. But like I said, I had gotten a little desensitized to those rockets after a while, that I could tell when something was, something was close or not. So I don't think I reacted as badly after Iraq. Like I said, I mentally prepared myself. I knew what to expect. I said, okay,
Right.
I'm going to go home. I'm going to transition back. I remember the way I transitioned after Afghanistan, how rough that was. This is going to be a different transition for me. I hadn't fired my weapon once while I was in Iraq. I was not out shooting at people every day. I was not in a person-to-person conflict. Other than rockets, I never had my physical safety threatened. Maybe riding around on a convoy once or twice, might be nervous about getting an IED or something, but other than that, I was always in a real safe environment. So that sense of strain was not nearly as much, and I think an outsider looking in at the old me might say I'm wrong, but I think I adjusted really well to the second one. I don't think I had nearly the problems that I did after the first one.
And you were back stateside for 6 months?
Well, no, I got back from Iraq in the summer of 2008. No, I'm sorry, December of 2008. Got back from Iraq. I got promoted to major like at the beginning of 2009, and they made me the operations officer for the battalion in Durant.
And there was an aspect that we haven't discussed yet, and that's the American public.
Mm-hmm.
How were you accepted at any point throughout it? Did it change at all?
Oklahoma's a great place to live.
Right.
Man, I've traveled all over the country, and some people just kind of look at you and say hi and don't really think much about it. But I'm like I said, I'm a major in the United States Army, National Guard. I'm an active duty major, working full time for the Guard. I make good money. You can go Google my pay scale anytime you want to. I feel guilty about going out to eat lunch in this town or any place in Oklahoma in uniform because I have trouble paying for my own lunch.
Uh-huh.
And I get that. That is a sense of patriotism and appreciation from people here. And people here are fiercely patriotic, and they always have been with me, to show a little bit of curiosity and a whole lot of gratefulness. And that's something that I'm always thankful for and always impressed by, but always a little uncomfortable with, because I never feel like I have done enough to deserve that from folks. Even to come and sit here and tell my story, I told my wife I was a little embarrassed to come do it because it seems like it's making a big deal about something that a lot of people have done and had worse than I have. And she said, yeah, but there are a lot of people that don't understand it. And she said, you could have been killed just like any of those guys that didn't come home.
That's very true. And in my experience, that's the common thing I hear, that it's always someone else who was the hero.
Yeah.
It was the other generation. It was the Vietnam guys.
Yeah.
And the Vietnam guys say that about the World War II guys.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure the same is true.
Yeah.
Had the military prepared you to deal with pressing questions from civilians? I had a veteran of the Iraq War say that whenever he reintegrated, the military had a process of asking, questions in a way that wasn't sensitive to the reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did you experience any of that?
No, I really never had much contact with media or press or anything, or people in general. Little kids would come up and ask, were you in the war? Yeah. Did you ever shoot anybody? Was always their question. Which I always tell people that's not a good question to ask, because the only two answers you'll get are yeah, and the guy will be uncomfortable out telling you, or no, and the guy's uncomfortable, like I didn't, does that mean that I didn't go and do something necessary if I didn't kill anybody? Or the really uncomfortable third option is the guy says, yeah, it was great, and then we think, was this guy psychotic or something? Mm-hmm. So that's, that, other than dealing with those awkward questions from little kids and friends and whatever. And there's another one, my son, Rufus, would tell his friends, don't pop balloons around him. Don't ask him if he killed anybody, because that's not something you ought to ask.
Right.
He didn't get that one until about 9 or 10. Which, there's a significant thing after the second deployment with my stepson Rafa. By the time I went to Iraq, he at that point was about 11 or 12 years old, and he'd been really young, like 6, 7 when I was on the first trip to Afghanistan, and he didn't really get it. And then at like 11, 12 years old, he looked at me going to Iraq, and he said one day, you could have been killed in Afghanistan, huh? I said, well, I could get killed driving down the highway here in a car wreck, or I could, tornado could blow the house away, or I could get cancer and die, whatever, anything could happen to you. But yeah, I could get killed in Afghanistan too. And he said, well, are you going to be in the same situation in Iraq where you could be killed? And I said, I don't really know. I said, but I've been protected in some way from the last 2 trips overseas. I think I'll be okay on this one,
Mm-hmm.
And which I don't know what you tell your kids in that situation other than it's okay.
Right.
But yeah, he started to put together about the third deployment that I could get killed, and that would be, all right, stepdad's not coming home. And I could see that affected him in a different way then, And I tell people that generation of kids who were in those really formative years when 9/11 happened,
mm-hmm.
are going to grow up to be, and I think you'll see it already, they're much more conservative, and they're a much more isolationist kind of generation, because they're fearful of what an outside threat has done or could do to this country, because it happened to them in a time that was really formative for them as a generation.
Mm-hmm.
And you can name things of any generation, say, where were you when the towers fell? Or where were you when a man landed on the moon? You and I don't know, or where were you when Kennedy was killed?
Right.
And those kind of events have a formative opinion on a generation, and that I think 9/11 we'll see later with the generation of kids that are 19, 20 years old right now.
Absolutely.
That there will be a marked, noticeable effect of 9/11 on the way they think about the world and their political beliefs as well.
Just to clarify, you've been married twice?
I'm on my third marriage.
You're on your third marriage.
Marriages are not good for the Army, or vice versa. I was going to Fort Benning, Georgia, for about 6 months, and came home. And my first trip away from home for 6 months, and came home and was greeted with a divorce. And then I got home from my fourth deployment. Came home from my fourth deployment and the end of my second marriage.
So the stepson is from the second marriage. Okay, that's where the
marriage.
confusion was coming from. Okay.
Yeah. So me living half my life on the other side, or half that decade on the other side of the world, was not good for our marriage at all.
All right.
So.
Well, let's talk about your fourth deployment. Where did you go from there?
So, in the evolution of the Guard's use there, the war in Iraq started to wind down, but the active force had been just hammered one deployment after another for a decade. And really what you'll see in all the operational forces, Army, National Guard too, the Army is pretty big, the National Guard's pretty big. But when you look specifically at the people who conduct combat operations, the infantry guys, the guys that carry rifles and shoot at people or hold ground, it dwindles down to a small group of people. And then you look at those and say, who's medically fit to deploy? Who's healthy, who's got all their stuff in order, who's not about to get out or get in, hasn't completed training, etc. It gets down to a really small pool of people. And even here in Oklahoma, like I said, I went to Egypt with one battalion, came home and went to Iraq or Afghanistan with the brigade headquarters. I came back, that battalion went to Afghanistan. While that battalion's in Afghanistan, that brigade headquarters goes to Iraq, and then we come back and we all go to Afghanistan a fourth time. And it's the same people doing all these multiple deployments, just getting moved from one unit to another to fill it up. Mm-hmm. And then when you look at the size of the force in American population, it's about half of 1%, 0.49% of Americans serve in the military today. Mm-hmm. And then you look in the military itself, of that 0.49%, and it's a much smaller force who have been overseas and shot at or been shot at by somebody and conducted combat operations. So, by the time we got down to the end of 2011, the Army's running out of resources to put in the fight on a daily basis, and they've seen over the last decade, hey, the Guard does a pretty good job of this. They're pretty good as an organization. They're effective. So we get the alert order. The 45th gets a call and says, hey, we're going to alert the 45th. You're going to go back to Afghanistan. They know that we've got Afghanistan history, experience, leadership, and they're going to put us out there in the full combat role now. We're going to be a landowner. We're going to be a brigade combat team, which means we're going to be out there and have a province that belongs to us and be fighting a fight right along some active duty unit to our left and right. And so we mobilized, got really well resourced, and went down to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, started getting all the new equipment fielded, the multicam uniforms, the plate carriers, where I had spent $2,000 to get ready to go to my first Afghanistan trip. I didn't spend a dime to go the last time. The Army had in a lot of ways had figured out how to resource and supply mobilizations. We started learning. We'd adapted as an Army over time. Okay, I know how to mobilize and deploy a unit effectively in a pretty good manner now. So we improved in that 10-year span. The thing that I saw happening from a strategic level, they mobilized the 45th, 3,000 plus soldiers, and while we were at the mobilization station down at Camp Shelby, we got the notification that the force cap in Afghanistan was cut. So they're starting to shrink the size of the force in Afghanistan down in the looming drawdown. Mm-hmm. We're getting out of Afghanistan. We're putting a mark on the wall. 2014, we're getting out there. So, rather than like I talked about back in 2004, when I saw a date when I said, there's our end state right there, we just achieved what we could call a victory, let's leave. We now, rather than say, here's the victory, here's the date we're going to achieve victory, we rather than set that on conditions on the ground, we've made a mark on the wall and put a time next to it. We're tired of it. America's war weary, that's something that eats at me when I hear people say Americans are war weary, because not a lot of Americans have done what we've done, what soldiers have done. Americans might be tired of hearing about it. These are the guys that could be war weary if we were, and I'm not war weary. I think if we're going to do it, do the right thing. Now, I told you right off we should have finished it in 2004, but we didn't. So let's figure out how to do it right. Anyway, so we get to Camp Shelby, Mississippi. They let us know there's a force drawdown coming, and they off-rail 2 battalions, the 180th out of Durant and the 160th Field Artillery out of Chandler. Both get sent to Kuwait to do theater sustainment operations in Kuwait and force protection stuff in Kuwait. Not because we didn't need them in Afghanistan to conduct our mission, but because the Department of the Army got notified and basically pushed down to the National Guard Bureau, down to us, you're only allowed to take X number of soldiers into Afghanistan. So they took our smallest 2 battalions and sent them to Kuwait instead. So when we got into Afghanistan, we deployed down to Logman Province, which is basically one valley over from where Korengal is, the Restrepo movie I referred to. We're the next valley over from that in Logistical province now, just north of Jalalabad, and we're doing that job there with about 2 battalions now, plus a sustainment battalion, and we're essentially doing full spectrum operations there in Logistical province. At that time, like I said, I'd been promoted. I'd been the executive officer at the 180th for about 2 years, and then right after we mobilized, they moved me over to be the plans officer for the infantry brigade. So at the infantry brigade, the structure is there's a lieutenant colonel that's the operations officer. He runs all the operations on a daily basis, and then you've got another major, my counterpart, who runs current operations. So he's the guy in there in the operations center overseeing the fight, and then I'm the guy that's looking at the future. What are we doing next week? What are we doing 2 weeks from now? What are we doing in regard to a strategic plan to make us get to an end state that we're trying to achieve? What is our end state? How are we defining success, and how are we getting there? So I'm the guy that's trying to assist the commander, the operations officer, and with the direction of the division headquarters there, get us toward our desired end state, which was, at this point, was really satisfying for me in that job, that I had, had all these opinions about what we did right and what we did wrong, and I had to sit a lot of days from a lower level, position of a company grade combat advisor with no effect on the strategic plan. Now that I'm controlling or influencing, I'll say, the operations of an entire province, and I can pick up the phone and call the guys at the division headquarters in Bagram, who have the 2- and 3-star generals' ears up there, and say, we're not doing this right, and here's why. The 1st Cav Division was the headquarters there at the time. General Valesky was the deputy chief of operations for 1st Cav Division. Real good guy, aggressive, go-getter kind of fella. And what I got from their entire staff was that they had a lot of experience in Iraq. So the division headquarters above us, the 1st Cav Division, had not deployed to Afghanistan before. And their staff was great, their leadership was great, but I could see ingrained in them, in some regards, this mindset that was very applicable to a largely city-dwelling population in Iraq, and not really focused on the differences that were going on in Afghanistan, cultural and otherwise. Like I said, we fought a series of 1-year wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, both that a lot of Americans, being kind of culturally centric, because we don't get exposed to other cultures much, being this big landlocked country they are, it's hard for us to get our head wrapped around what is effective and what's not in those places. So I felt like I was starting to have some be in a position where I could have some influence and get us to do things in a smarter way. One of the big pushes that always came down from division headquarters of any brand out there in Afghanistan was to do these big valley clearing operations, where we would land on one end of the valley and do hands across the desert and march up the valley and search houses and ask questions and talk to people, and have a blocking force at the end of the valley. And so we'd walk from one end to the other and see what we see and find out what we find out. And that was kind of our general practice of how do we make changes across the province. As well, let's start in this valley down here in the southeast or southwest. Let's clear one valley at a time all the way across the province. But fighting a counterinsurgency is, it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. And that was always my argument with the division plans guys, is what does an insurgent look like when we land in our helicopter and he goes and puts his weapon down? It looks like everybody else. We're going to walk right past him, unless we can find the weapon that he had hid under whichever random rock or under the mattress in the house or whatever. We're not going to find or catch anybody. We're just going to go out there, and I say we go over there and dump over their apple cart and leave, which doesn't do anything but create more enemies. So I was always pushing for us to have a much more targeted effort at finding leadership. Look for bad guys, develop good intelligence. And we, as an army and as a mechanism, never got as good as I wanted us to be. When I got to Afghanistan on that second deployment, and I went into Logistical province, and I started looking at the map and looking at the valleys on the map and saying, okay, this is Sangar Valley. Who lives up here? Who's the village elder? What tribe is this? Nobody knew. And I thought, man, we've been here a decade. How do I not know? Have we not done something that looks like a census? And you can tell me where every village is, what the name of that village is, what the tribal leader is there, how many people are in his family, who are his brothers, what influences and ties do they have. At least tell me the name of who owns the house the last time we checked. But we didn't have any of that. There was no composite, there was no data that was collected that was readily available for operations guys to go, who lives right there? Or, why are we finding 5 bad guys in this house together? Well, no, it's just a house there. Well, who owns the house? We don't know. How does ownership work in Afghanistan? There are a lot of those kind of questions that we never delved into to get down to, solving complex problems about finding bad guys. So we got to Afghanistan in that summer of 2011, and we got there right in the middle of fighting season, which fighting season in Afghanistan is the spring and fall, or spring and summer months primarily. It gets cold and high desert and mountainous in the wintertime, and they kind of like the Civil War days here. In the winter they go home and stay warm and try to survive till the summer comes again. So we hit Logistical province in May, June of 2011 in the peak fighting season, and we started, the 45th started pushing out into areas that nobody had been in and hadn't heavily patrolled or anything in quite some time. And we took a lot of casualties that summer. And we had IED strikes and some direct fire that summer, and there were a lot of folks here back home, even in Oklahoma, that started watching us real closely. I know, find out what was going on over there. It was tough. It was tough for us because we just felt like we were continually getting hammered. And like I said, every time we would have casualty or have a soldier wounded and evac out of the country, I'd sit down and look at my operations and ask myself, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing right? How can I make this, make us more effective? And part of it was just operational tempo, but part of it was us learning the fight in Afghanistan at that time, and it had changed a lot from what we were familiar with from the guys that were there in 03, 04. They were much more heavily reliant on IEDs. They would try to isolate us from the population by using IEDs a lot. And the big push through the Army was to get these big mine-resistant, ambush-protected, V-shaped hull vehicles that cost $1 million a piece, and use those to go up and down the mountains or up and down the valleys with. But they look like a rolling castle to the Afghan population. All it does is isolate you from the population more, and still makes you a target. You make a bigger bomb, I'll make a bigger vehicle. I'll make a bigger vehicle, you make a bigger bomb. It goes on and on. And that's, we started to learn that late in the summer, that the only way to defeat those IEDs in country were to get out of your truck and walk. You got to get out of your truck. You got to clear the sides of the roads as you go up those valleys. So a lot of our patrols that were going long distance, say 15, 20 kilometers up a valley into Logistical province, they would get out of their truck. They'd still have the trucks with them in a convoy, but you kick guys out on the sides of the road, and they walk up the road 15 kilometers from one village to the next, or one base to the next, one fob to the next, one COP to the next, combat outpost to the next, just to get there without losing anybody. And the IEDs were tough on us this last deployment. So about the time I got comfortable with operations, and I was embedded pretty well with the 201st Corps, which was the Afghan Army Corps that I was with that time. I got approached by some guys from the asymmetric warfare group asking us if we wanted to go through training to conduct focused targeting force operations. And the focused targeting force basically does much more of what I thought we needed to be doing, which was, rather than doing big valley clearing operations, let's start targeting leadership and go after leadership. And So I talked to General Sadiq, who was the Afghan brigade commander there, talked to my boss, Lieutenant Colonel Walter, said, hey, I'd like to get an American platoon and an Afghan platoon and send them through, have the asymmetric warfare group guys come here to Gambiri, train us on all the techniques of how to do focused targeting force operations, and then let me start taking the FTF, the focused targeting force, out and targeting leadership with that, and doing, commander can use this however he wants to, but primarily I think we can be effective by targeting leadership of the Taliban, Hig, and the Hezbollah, Gulbadani, I think it is, there in Logman province, all the little anti-coalition groups that were out to kill us. And so I was just looking for ways to shape that fight. Had a real good relationship with the Afghan brigade commander, because like I said, I learned how to speak Dari well enough on my first deployment, and it stuck with me that I was immediately kind of welcomed back in with the Afghans when I got back. As a matter of fact, I ran into my old company commander from the first deployment. He was still there and had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, so he got promoted faster than me. But he was the base operations engineer there at Gambiri, at the little fob I was on. And it was like a big homecoming when I got there, and we're going to cook you a meal and come over and see us, and so I was welcomed right back in. They're like, oh, this is Riley. He was here back when we were first brigade or when we were second brigade, back before the Corps formed. So they knew that I was there in the beginning. A lot of us from Oklahoma were there in the beginning of the formation of the Army. So we had that tie with them that, man, you've been here with us from day one. So we had war stories to tell with each other, and where were you then, and did you go to Kandahar with us? So we could dig up history with these guys. Even the interpreters, I had one interpreter that was telling me, he was kind of lecturing me one day about Afghanistan, and I said, how old are you? And he said, I'm 18, 17 years old. And I said, huh? I said, you were 12 when I was here the first time. So he kind of got I said, I've been fighting the Taliban since you were 12 years old. So he kind of got the sense that this wasn't my first rodeo over there, and I got a little more respect that way. Plus, like I said, the language helped a lot to be able to go in and sit down and talk to them in their own tongue. But so I got General Sadiq to give me a platoon from his reconnaissance company, who were really good soldiers. Which overall the quality of the Afghan soldiers was not what it was in 2003, 2004. But that reconnaissance platoon had been well trained. Whoever trained them back in Kabul had done an outstanding job. And if I could find the guy, I'd shake his hand. But they did a good job, and they were disciplined, hardcore young soldiers that were ready to go out and fight and do what we needed to do. And then I got a platoon from 1st Platoon Alpha 179, which is the headquarters out of Stillwater here in Oklahoma. So that they had just lost their platoon leader to an IED strike a few weeks before, and had been pulled in to the 179 headquarters there, pulling security until they got a new platoon leader fielded to them. So they got their new platoon leader on site. His name was McCullough, good lieutenant, captain now, and they brought those two platoons down to me, and the asymmetric warfare group guys and I started training them on how to do raids, basically. So we would go out and conduct raids to kill, capture, the insurgent leadership, which was super challenging, but it was an amazing experience for me. Just to see all of the technology and the military might from the American side of the fight come in, and essentially I'd had all this capability at my fingertips: close air support, helicopters, and intelligence gathering capabilities, and then the forces on the ground, the command and control that I had with the technology that we had now to be able to maneuver soldiers around on the battlefield. And like I said, the end of the I can't remember the name of it, the end of the Bin Laden movie where they go out and do the Bin Laden raid, is about as close as I could show anybody of what those were like. But those were not without their challenges for us. We were, a lot of times our lack of cultural awareness caused us to be our own worst enemy. It became a big joke around with us, but we had two guys with the same name that lived 150 yards apart, both named Barry Ali, and acting on the intel we got one day, I went in and arrested the wrong one. And the special forces guys down in Gambiri called me up and said, hey, this is hard work and you guys need to really think about what you're doing there. And then I think they arrested the same guy like 3 months later. And I was like, yeah, that's the one we got. That's the wrong one. But we just, that lack of cultural awareness was tough for us. I went into General Sadiq's office, the Afghan brigade commander general there, one day, and I was trying to tell him about a raid I wanted to do up in the northern part of Logan province for one of their top Taliban commanders in the area. And the name that I had got from our intel guys was Chapow. And I showed him, we want to go up here and go after Chapow. And he says, who? And I think, how could this guy not know who the top Taliban commander in his AO is, his area operations is? Chapow, right? And I showed him on the map, and I said, Chapow lives right here. And he says, oh, and even myself, having spoken the language, but not familiar with some of the Pashai was the language there, the Pashai and the Nuristani names there. I thought, well, maybe it's something I haven't heard before, but I always thought his name sounded different than any Afghan name that I'd heard. And I finally went over it several times with him before I finally got him to understand what I was saying and where I was talking about. And he says, oh, you mean Chapel Wall. And I thought to myself, man, we are so obtuse in our culture that I've been walking around asking people about this guy for months now, and I can't even say his name right for them to recognize who I'm asking about. So there's some of the on-the-ground challenges that we had as an Army, and like I said, I'm probably one of the, from our task force, one of the better guys with the language, and we still couldn't get close to being right. It's hard to make that cultural jump to be able to fight side by side or to have an effective impact on a culture that you don't understand. And that's 10 years later doing this rotational fight, that's where we still were. And just like a lot of things that Americans do when we have trouble, we just kept throwing money at the problem instead of really digesting it.
Can you talk a little bit about how you went after high targets? After you captured a high target, did you try to interrogate this guy to give you information on a higher target?
That stuff is completely out of my hands.
Oh, okay. right.
Well, and here's, back in my first deployment, we grabbed somebody and we held them, we detained them, we questioned them. We got to get battlefield information, we call it, out of them, and then we would have to figure out how to transport them somewhere. We didn't have as many resources. Sometimes we drive them, sometimes we get a helicopter come get them, whatever, on the first trip. This last deployment, because of all the detainee sensitivity that there was, when I got a detainee and I got any evidence, we would collect evidence, we'd take fingerprints, we would get, whatever evidence we could find from where we captured them. It all had to be tagged and tracked and cataloged and put with the detainee. And we would have, before I went on a mission, I would plan an extraction plan that included a place for detainees to get extracted as well. And I had to send my detainee and escorts. I was provided 2 escorts per detainee to basically prove that nobody's hurting this guy. And they would take him to Bagram Airfield to their detention facility there, which has since turned over to the Afghans. So we don't really, other than capture them on the battlefield, we don't handle the detainees. They're prosecuted through the Afghan civil courts now, or Afghan court system. So once I've got somebody off the battlefield, I put them on a helicopter with the evidence and sworn statements that I have. And I carried sworn statement right there in my pocket on the raid. Kick in the door, capture a guy, take a knee, write a sworn statement on a piece of paper, and put it in a plastic bag and send it with him. So when he gets to Bagram Airfield, they say, "Here's this guy. He was captured at this place with these things. You know, here's a machine gun that he had. Here's a bunch of documents he has relating to Taliban or whatever it was. You know, that we basically had to build a case and send it with him to go off to Bagram Airfield, and then hope that the Afghan court system said, "Yep, looks guilty to me," or if not, they'd turn loose and he'd be back in your AO a short time later. So challenging.
Sounds very challenging. Is there anything from that last deployment, a specific event that you want to talk about?
You know, the main thing that I took away from that is the capability that we demonstrated, that the 45th demonstrated. You know, like I said, we lost soldiers. That was tough. That was a struggle for all of us. It was a struggle for families back here, and there's nothing you can do to replace those soldiers other than try to honor what they did. But here we are at the end of a decade of conflict, and I've seen, like I said, us go from that peacekeeping force up to conducting full spectrum operations out there side by side with the active duty forces, and to the point that General Valesky, the DCO, the Deputy Chief of Operations for 1st Cav Division, came down to us one day and was after one of my missions and said, "Man," he said, "you Thunderbirds are really getting after it, 45th." He said, "Man, really, you guys are really getting after it." He said, "I wish every task force in the country was as aggressive as you are," which is, kind of a testament of the effectiveness of the Guard. So, here at the end of a decade of conflict, I fear us going back to being that Army of 1993 that I know, that got to a point in our training at the end of the Cold War where we said, we don't know what our core competencies are. We don't know what we need to do to be successful, so we'll just do what we used to do. And people talk about, well, we need to, today, Army officers and leadership talk about us getting back to our core competencies. And I argue that we don't know what they are right now. We've got to, there are some things that we will always need to know how to do as an Army. Always. You'll need to know how to supply yourself logistically. You'll know how to defend, attack, basic things. But I like to tell people, I'm terrible with a sword and a short sword and a shield. At one point in history, that would have been a core competency for any warrior.
Mm-hmm.
That one's gone now. It's not our core competency anymore. And I really think right now what you're seeing in the military with all the struggles that we have to define what we do and how we do it is us trying to define our core competencies for the future. What's the next fight going to look like? Is it going to be counterinsurgency and IEDs? Is it going to be something completely different? Is it going to be a mix of old and new? But we don't really know. And it's going to take some smart people to figure that stuff out.
All right.
And then the other thing I'll say, now, just like I said, I survived the Clinton era budget cuts and cuts to the military and the shrink of the force, and there's big talk these days about all the money that was spent on the war and how big the Defense Department budget is, and I see huge amounts of waste every day, and it makes me hurt just to see sometimes a lack of conscience involved, because there's no mechanism in the United States government to save $1. You get to the end of the year and they say spend it all so you can get the same amount next year. And you never hear on the Capitol Hill, and this is probably stuff that is sensitive and I shouldn't yell about it, but you never see anybody at the end of the day say, "Hey, we had money left over, let's put it up or pay the debt with it." Instead it's, "Hey, we've got money left over, let's find a way to spend it all." Mm-hmm. Which is not, in my mind, a good use of tax revenue. Anyway, so here we are at the end of the war. Things are winding down in Afghanistan. There's still conflicts all over the place. And Congress has already talked about reducing the size of the Defense Department budget and reducing the size of the force. The National Guard falls under the Department of Defense, under the Department of the Army. So the Department of the Army, looking out for the active duty forces, by default going to come in and say, we need to get rid of some of the National Guard. My argument, after 10 years of us demonstrating our capabilities and of me knowing that we're a 33% cost based on what the active duty force costed the United States taxpayer. The smart decision is to utilize the National Guard as the manpower for the defense of the nation. You hear on Fox News and wherever they talk about the size of the Army. We're going to reduce the Army back to pre-World War II. Well, we were fighting the entire conflict of the globe in World War II with a manpower-driven fight. We didn't have all the technology that we do now to be as effective on the battlefield. I can go anywhere in the world, or anywhere in Afghanistan that I want to, with a company with 130 men, because we're more lethal now. You know, I can do a lot more damage with 30 men today than I could with 30 men in 1942 because of the technology I have at my fingertips. So I think it's important for the Guard now to, after the end of this conflict, to tell its story and say, look at the capabilities that exist and look at the cost to benefit analysis before you just arbitrarily say, we'll just reduce the size of the Guard. There's a lot of capabilities out there. There's a lot of good experience and a lot of good, good opportunity for economic future defense. You know, this huge standing army is something that's just been around for the last 50 years or so in most democracies, and it's probably not always going to be a good thing.
Right.
The Greeks figured that out a long time ago.
I wondered if you could comment to a lot of the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan have experienced multiple deployments, and the toll of such service has an effect on the individual. What would you like to comment about that?
The toll of multiple deployments, it changes you. Like I said before, and we talked about the fact that every generation kind of holds in honor the generation before, and I always said, well, I'm sure their experiences were worse than mine, you know, and I still believe that Vietnam veterans had it harder than I did, the World War II veterans had it harder than I did, but I've got more time in country than most of either of those conflicts. You know, I've got, I don't even know how many. I've got months and months of time in Iraq and Afghanistan, more than, you know, you could have fought the entire duration of the European conflict of World War II in the time span of 2 of my deployments. So I've had a lot of time in the theater of war, and that changes you, and it gives you a skewed, in a certain way, not skewed it isn't wrong. I don't know if it's wrong or right, but I have a skewed sense of the world, and I know every other veteran does now too. And it gives you a little more isolated feeling in society a lot of days, you know. Like I said, I think Oklahoma's a great place to live, and I know that people here are very patriotic, but it always makes me uncomfortable to hear that, thank you for your service, and you know, because for a long time I thought, well, nobody really knows what it means, you know, but I appreciate them saying it. But it's, you know, you kind of, a lot of days you feel like you're an alien. You know, you can't explain it to people, what'd you do, or, you know, what's it like, or, you know, it's hard to describe. Unless you've been there, it's hard to put that into somebody else's brain, the perspective.
I'll break this question into 2 parts because in many ways it is very separate. What steps does both American society and the American government need to take in order to aid veterans upon their reintegration?
That's a touchy one with me, especially with the VA conflict that's going on right now. I've got some pretty strong opinions about the VA and what ought to be done there, but it's just one opinion. But, you know, the big thing for redeploying soldiers, and I'll talk about the National Guard because that's my experience. We should have figured out a way to extend the reintegration process. The train-up that I went through every time was a mandatory set of training events. So I deployed 4 times. That meant of those 4 times, I went through the same mandatory training event 4 times to go to war.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were basic, like something you teach a basic soldier. Here's how you low crawl, or like get flat on the ground and crawl under fire. I had to do that 4 times as a infantry officer and a major with 3 deployments. For my 4th deployment, they made me get out there and demonstrate that I know how to low crawl. So we had 90 or more days on the front of our deployment of me being subjected to this mandatory training that I didn't need in order to say, yes, I've covered my liability and this unit can now go to war. In my opinion, all of that should have been done as an internal training process by the unit itself. I don't need the big army to tell me how to train my soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
I know how to train soldiers, and my unit knows how to train their soldiers. A lot of that pre-mobilization mandatory training time should have been moved to the backside of that deployment, and not let a soldier come home and say, well, did you have any problems? And they'll say, no, I'm good. Because every soldier comes back from the war and wants to get straight back to the house. You want to go see mom, dad, you want to go see your family, you want to get away from this thing. But the hard right would have been for us to move a month or more of that pre-mobilization training that was a largely wasted amount of time for anybody that had been more than once.
Mm-hmm.
Move that to the backside and say, okay, when you come home, we have a detailed reintegration process for you before you demobilize, before we drop you back out in society, and then just to be smart about the way we demobilize units. Never once of 4 deployments did I mobilize through Fort Sill, which would have made sense for an Oklahoma unit to mobilize in a local area. You could see your family once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
You could take a weekend and go home and check on your kids. You might make it home for a birthday in that 2 or 3 month period that you're at a local mobilization station rather than at Camp Shelby or Fort Carson. Some of the smart things that we could have done like that might have helped soldiers reintegrate some. And I know there's a network of support out there if soldiers will reach for it now. We've built up a network of suicide awareness, suicide prevention hotlines, medical support. It's just a matter of asking for help. And there was a stigma for a long time with the military about showing weakness, and I've heard people discuss that. And it's not some evil scheme on anybody's part. It's just the kind of people that we are. Mm-hmm. Most military folks are pretty independent and pretty type A. So it's not some secret cover up for us not to let people get help. It's just that we as soldiers are that kind of people that we really don't want to ask for it. Mm-hmm. I'd rather figure it out myself. Like I said, when I came back from Afghanistan the first time, I didn't go to counseling. I freaking turned up a bottle and worked through it myself, which is not the healthiest way to do it, but I was too stubborn to go ask somebody to help me out. Mm-hmm. So that's why we are the way we are. And how you crack that nut, I don't know.
I wondered if you could speak to females within the military service, mm-hmm. especially in regions such as Afghanistan, where females mm-hmm. have a subservient role in their own native country. Yeah. What effects does that have on the American presence in these nations?
Yeah. Well, man, that's a can of worms. So when they're, I come from a male-dominated career field in the infantry. We haven't allowed ever females in the infantry, and I disagree with that because I've had female soldiers that work for me that are as good, as strong, as fast, as tough as the males that are there too. I had on the focused targeting force I ran, I had a couple of females with me on every mission that are the female engagement team. So when we kick into a door and go into a house, it's not just going to be a bunch of guys around there. Females are going to be there too. And in order to be as the least amount of offensive as we can when you kick in somebody's door and drag them out, is to have females talk to their females. Mm-hmm. So we segregated our force to accommodate the enemy, or to accommodate the culture of the country that we're trying to support as well. And those, am glad to have any female in my organization who can do the job. I'd say a lot of times I'd like to have more males in my job in my organization could do the job. So having to be female, it doesn't bother me or doesn't affect me a bit. The Afghans and the Iraqis both would see our females and kind of look at them with a sense of curiosity as much as anything. Like, man, your females do that, and they just accept that we are a different kind of people and we're a different culture. They look at us through the screen of being foreign. You know, like if an alien landed and their females were twice as tall as all their males, we wouldn't question it. We go, okay, your females are all twice as tall as your males because you're different than us. And they never say, well, maybe our females could do that too. Their culture and their religion has skewed or dictated that sexism and that treatment of females in their culture to the point that they don't question it. That they don't say, well, I wonder why it's wrong for my daughter to learn to read and write. You know, and that was never about Islam. It's about power, and that's a whole nother 3-hour discussion. But the Muslim clerics have hijacked many of those countries and control them through fear and through indoctrination into you know, mistruths in order to maintain their power. And you know, and unfortunately, like I said before, you can't kill enough people to win a conflict like that. The only thing that we can do is educate them and allow them to educate themselves.
And you'll have to forgive me if these questions don't seem at all connected at this point, but under your command, men have been lost, great personal sacrifice within the fighting forces in the last 10 years of war in both Iraq and Afghanistan. How do you memorialize?
Well, some of it's probably kind of goofy, but it was good therapy. I didn't go to therapy after my last Afghan trip either. But I've got a band of 17 bullets on this arm, in this little sleeve tattoo, and each one of those bullets represents somebody to me. And then a very close friend of mine from the first deployment, John Stone, was killed on March of 28, 2006 in Afghanistan, and I wear a bracelet with his name on it, and I look at it every day when I get up in the morning, and sometimes when I just get frustrated about life and remind myself that I'm still here. And, you know, regardless of whether it's a cup of coffee that got cold or a flat tire or, you know, a sickness and disease or just general frustration with life about something related to the Army or not. You know, I remember there are a lot of good men and women that went before me that gave the ultimate sacrifice, and I didn't. I'm still here.
Absolutely. And I didn't know if I wanted to ask how you memorialized or just ask about your sleeve first. I recognize there was probably a connection there, though. So, I like to ask veterans, do they talk about politics while they're in the field with other other soldiers?
We do. And like I said, you know, we're encouraged not to have a political opinion in uniform, and that stands at odds with liberty in my mind. A free man has a free tongue, but as an Army officer, I try to stick to that military axiom, do what I'm told, and keep my mouth shut in public. Yeah, I've got some pretty strong opinions. I'm not a political person at all. I would be a terrible politician, but there have been a lot of days that I say I want to run for office one day when I get out of the military, just to stop some of the things that frustrate me so much, just to make a change. Not because I want my name on a wall or free health care or whatever, but because there are things that we as a nation do that drive me crazy. And but yeah, we talk to each other about it, but we try not to run it down in front of the rest of society. And that's a danger with an Army that becomes alienated from society. As I was talking about, we are so much different because of the deployments and the duration of war and the standards that the Army has for us. I can't grow a beard. I must keep my hair a certain way. I'm not supposed to have tattoos past the elbow to be able to enlist now. So if I was to go and enlist in the Army today, I wouldn't be allowed to join.
Right.
That's no tattoos below the elbow, and if you do, they must be less than 5, and you must be able to cover them with one hand. But what you see is an Army that sets a set of standards. Our fitness standards, our physical fitness standards, our height weight standards, all those things are standards that are slowly getting further and further away from the norms in American society. And when you, for a long duration of time, when you have a military that doesn't represent that representative democracy, it becomes something else. It becomes separate from the population. And I think that is a dangerous course for us to be taking. You'd be surprised that there's a diverse mix of people in the Army just like there is anywhere else. And I support that, but I think very much that the Army of the United States should be directly representative of the people of the United States. So if there are, and the statistic these days is 71% of military-aged youth in America, without even looking at them from day one, if in the recruiting force, I can look at a kid and say that 71% of them won't qualify. They're not qualified for me even to consider them to apply for the Army. So almost 3/4 of American population today aren't qualified to serve in the military. And then you take that other 24%, 29% that are eligible to serve, and that's the pool from which we pull people and say, would you like to join and recruit? So our applicant pool for the military gets smaller all the time based on height, weight, physical capabilities, pre-existing conditions, tattoos, their own inclination. And like I said, I see the military alienating itself from society, and I think that's a bad trend. The Greeks, I refer to a lot, I think had it right. In a representative democracy, everybody gets a vote, and everybody has the right to fight for their freedom. You don't ever lose your voice as a free man. You keep your free tongue. Over time, the Romans evolved that into a republic. The British evolved that into a commonwealth, and then we came along and kind of adopted some of those ideas of each one. But I think the Greeks had that right in the formation of democracy. I don't think there is anything such thing, or there shouldn't be such thing as gentry in American society. There aren't any dukes or duchesses or people that are more special than others. And even in the military, I see we have VIP parking for certain levels of officers, and even as an officer myself, I disagree with that stuff. That I'm an individual citizen. I have this rank and I have this duty as a position of and title as a position of servitude. They pay me more. They give me some benefits because they expect more of me, not because I'm special. And what I owe back is to give those soldiers under my command everything that I've got to ensure their success, to ensure that the mission is met, and that they all come home alive and healthy. And I don't get a special parking spot for that. If I need a special parking spot, I need to show up earlier than they are.
Right. In the last 70 years, the Army has been in some ways a vehicle for social mobility,
Mm-hmm.
with the GI Bill, various aspects of that. And today, in modern society, have those influences of joining the military, for example, like you hear recruiters say this is the way to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
How effective is the military as a vehicle of social mobility?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a life-changing thing. Going is because it's the easiest to relate. My own personal story. I came from a family of folks that nobody in my family had a college degree. They're all farmers and ranchers, and if I hadn't joined the National Guard at the age of 17, I'd probably be in Boca Chico feeding cows right now. Nothing wrong with that. I just wouldn't have the experience or the education that I do, and probably not making the same money that I do now. So yeah, it has absolutely been an impact, a positive impact on my life, and those of countless others that I see around me every day that I can't even begin to explain to people. when I was, like I said, a couple years ago, or last year, I guess, I was a commander for the Officer Candidate School for Oklahoma. And once in a while, I'd have an officer candidate that would end up in my office saying, I want to quit the program, and I'd ask them why. And, you know, one of the things that I would always tell them is, you're standing in front of a door here to, you know, you're going to go left or right, and if you choose this path over that one, there are opportunities that you don't even know or understand the implications of yet that you're shutting the door on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I tell them, you know, is to be an Army officer, or in the case of this discussion, a soldier in general, opens doors for you with people from the sense of credibility that you have that they couldn't understand. So if I walk into a job interview and say, "Hi, my name is Shane Riley, I'm a major in the United States Army," there's a sense of credibility that comes with that right off the bat. And say, okay, I can depend on this guy. He's going to do what he says he's going to do. He's going to show up at work on time. He's going to be forthright. He's going to be trustworthy. But if you don't, in as much as the training is valuable, if you don't carry that title, you lose opportunity. And again, the intrinsic value of the training for you to go through basic training, to make yourself a better disciplined person, to learn how to think for yourself, to get, as I told my officer candidates, the intent of all these things is to make you more comfortable in uncomfortable situations. I can put you in an uncomfortable situation and you'll keep your calm and make good decisions, which is what life's all about. You know, so the things that the military does for people to train them how to do that, to make decisions in uncomfortable situations, absolutely will set you up for success no matter what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. And I realize we're being long-winded, so I'll try to keep these questions short, but I'd like to ask them nevertheless. As a veteran who's experienced war, I like to ask this because war brings out both the best and the worst in humanity. Could you speak to that? What are the best and the worst facets of humanity that you personally experienced?
Well, you know, I'll speak through my American eyes. The greatest sense of compassion that you will get is from people in wartime helping each other, trying to help each other. The greatest sense of selflessness that you see is one soldier trying to protect another on the battlefield, putting yourself between your buddy and the door to keep him from getting shot. That sense of worth, for, you know, sense of your willingness to put your own safety away to protect others. And then, you know, and then the flip side of that very same coin is the brutality of it all. I was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina yesterday, and I went out for a run while I was there. And there's a basic training unit there, and off in the woods there, I could hear the basic training company that was out there on a rifle range shooting. So you could just hear off in the distance, pow, pow, pow on the rifle range, just sporadic gunfire. And as I jog along, I jog within distance of an elementary school that was there, you know, like a elementary school there on Fort Jackson. And I could hear all these kids from the elementary school out at recess, playing and screaming and yelling and having a good time. But from a distance, a group of kids playing just sounds like kids screaming. And the mix of that gunfire off in the distance and those kids screaming yesterday reminded me of the worst parts of war, which is, you know, the devastating effect that it has on humanity of all ages. And we don't, you know, as much as we try to protect human life, there are times that kids get killed. That's one of the hardest things to deal with, is just the brutality of war.
Mm-hmm. Before I ask my final question, is there anything throughout this interview that you wanted to talk about that I haven't asked or hasn't come up yet?
Nope. I think
All
we're
right.
good.
All right. Final question. How would you want to be remembered by history?
I don't know that I necessarily, you know, I don't care if I'm ever memorialized. I'll be dead and gone, and nobody knows your name. And, you know, I have a pretty real sense of how temporary we are here. People ask me about my tattoo and say, man, I can't imagine you got that, and that's forever. I have to say, no, it's not. It's just till you die. You know, this is I'm 42 years old now, and it's happened really fast to this point. I know it's not going to get any slower.
Well, a
You know?
variation of that question is,
Yeah,
what would you?
but as for my generation,
Mhm.
as for the soldiers, the service members that have fought this war with me, alongside me, you know, I think back to the World War II generation. People call them the greatest generation and talk about their sense of duty and loyalty and sacrifice. And I really, you know, I have seen so many amazing young people with stories of hardship and sacrifice that most people could never imagine, and they're resilient, and they're dedicated, and they're patriotic, and they're willing to serve, and they're willing to give of themselves for the betterment of others, and to a point that it just humbles you to not only to be in charge of things sometimes, but it makes me feel pretty unworthy once in a while to think, yeah, I'm the boss of these guys, and you know, golly, it's overwhelming to think how humbling an experience that is to be put in charge of people that are that good, that honest, that caring, that compassionate, and that tough. You know, that they're going to do the right thing every time, and they're always going to be there when you need them. And I hope people recognize that and remember that in this generation, that they don't just see whatever they pulled from the media and think we're a bunch of crazy people that went to war and saw a bunch of atrocities and came home.
Absolutely. Well, I realize that this term gets thrown around a lot without much meaning, but I'd like to assure you mine does. As someone who's grown up in a democracy and a peaceful society, I'd like to thank you for your service for your country.
Thank you.
And I would like to thank you as a historian for sharing that story with us.
Thank you.
All right.